Hey there, tonight we're uncovering what building a pyramid was like in Egypt. Not the fairy tale version, you know, but the surprising truth that these marvels were born from the hands of skilled laborers, not enslaved masses. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. The sun blazes down on the Giza Plateau, a landscape dominated by dust, ambition, and the grand dreams of Pharaoh Khufu. It's around 2500 BCE, and Egypt is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the ancient world. This is a time when pyramids were more than just oversized tombstones for the well-to-do. They were the skyscrapers of their era, reaching toward the heavens and proclaiming the glory of the pharaohs. But hold your horses, or chariots, because these pyramids were also religious devotion carved in stone, the ultimate expression of a belief system that wedded the earthly to the divine. Khufu wasn't just any ruler. He was the big cheese, the head honcho, the man with the ultimate god complex. His great pyramid wasn't an afterthought or a side project. It was his magnum opus, standing at a jaw-dropping height of about 146. 6 meters, that's 481 feet for the metrically challenged. It was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Think of it as the ancient world's Burj Khalifa, minus the glitzy skyline and fancy elevators. This monumental task wasn't achieved by a handful of slaves laboring under the crack of a whip, as Hollywood might have you believe. Nope, the reality was far more complex, and dare we say, organized. Enter the workforce. Tens of thousands of workers, not enslaved but conscripted, and some even voluntary. These folks were the OG construction crew, clocking in long hours under the relentless Egyptian sun. The workers were fed a diet that would make craft beer enthusiasts raise an eyebrow: bread and beer. Yes, you heard that right. Bread and beer were the ancient equivalent of a paycheck, a motivational carrot on a stick to keep the workforce moving and grooving. Now, why bread and beer? Besides the obvious appeal, who doesn't love carbs and a good brew? They were staples of the Egyptian diet and vital for a laborious sustenance. Bread provided the necessary calories, while beer, which was lower in alcohol than today's standards, offered hydration. This liquid bread was brewed from barley and emmer wheat, a concoction that was thick, nutritious, and let's face it, probably an acquired taste. So, how did these pyramid builders get their marching orders? The whole process was orchestrated by a hierarchy of overseers and skilled workers, kind of like project managers and engineers today, minus the Gantt charts and PowerPoint presentations. You had specialists like quarrymen, who extracted limestone blocks from nearby quarries, and boatmen, who transporting these behemoths down the Nile. It was like an ancient supply chain, with less email and more shouting. Politically, this was a time when Pharaoh Khufu wielded absolute power, a deity on earth with the authority to conscript labor and resources for his pyramid-building venture. The economy thrived on agriculture, with the annual flooding of the Nile providing rich soil for crops. This agricultural surplus allowed the state to support large-scale projects like the pyramids, but let's not sugarcoat it. Life for these workers wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Conditions were harsh, and labor was backbreaking. Injuries were common, and the work was relentless. Yet they were part of something monumental, a legacy that would endure for millennia, long after the dust had settled. And speaking of dust, the construction site was a whirlwind of activity, with workers hauling, cutting, and setting stones in a well-rehearsed ballet of brute strength and ingenuity. For a civilization that revered the afterlife as much as the Egyptians did, these pyramids were more than just final resting places. They were celestial staircases, offering the pharaoh a path to the afterlife, a direct line to Ra, the sun god. And Khufu's pyramid was no exception. Its very design was a cosmic map, with chambers and passageways aligned to the cardinal points and celestial bodies. turning stone into a symphony of spirituality. So, what's the takeaway here? Pyramids weren't just piles of stones stacked up by enslaved masses under the tyrannical gaze of a despot. They were the product of a complex society with a robust economy, an organized workforce, and a ruler whose vision was as towering as the structure itself. They were the ultimate flex, a testament to human ingenuity and the lengths we'll go to immortalize our legacies. And that's just scratching the surface of this epic tale. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the nuts and bolts of pyramid construction, the logistics, the engineering marvels, and the stories of the people who built them. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that the past is never as simple or as glamorous as it seems. Now, if you thought organizing a kid's birthday party was tough, try orchestrating the construction of a pyramid with 3 million stones. That's right, 3 million. Each stone block weighed about 25 tons. That's like stacking a couple of SUVs on top of each other. And remember, this was an age before cranes, forklifts, or even a decent wheelbarrow. The Egyptians had to rely on sheer human muscle, ingenuity, and of course, a little help from the Nile. Quarrying limestone wasn't just a day at the rock park. The limestone blocks were chiseled out using copper tools, which, let's be honest, were about as durable as a chocolate teapot. Yet, these ancient craftsmen made it work. They were the MacGyvers of their time. The quarries were often located near the construction site, specifically in Tura, just across the Nile. They capitalized on the annual inundation of the Nile, which transformed it into a natural conveyor belt. The blocks were floated downstream on wooden barges, making logistics managers today drool with envy over such a streamlined supply chain. But let's not get carried away with the romance of floating stones down the river. This was no lazy Sunday paddle. Transporting these behemoths required a Herculean effort. The blocks were loaded onto sledges, which were then dragged across the desert sands. And here's the kicker. To reduce friction, workers poured water on the sand ahead of the sledges. This little trick, discovered by modern physicists, effectively halved the labor force needed. Who knew desert sand could be so thirsty? Once the blocks arrived at the construction site, it was time for some heavy lifting, literally. Without cranes, the Egyptians employed ramps to elevate the stones. These ramps were engineering marvels in their own right. 3 types were likely used: straight, zigzagging, and circular, each with its pros and cons. Straight ramps were quick, but required an obscene amount of material to build. Zigzagging ramps were more economical but slower. Circular ramps, spiraling up the pyramid, were the Goldilocks option, just right in terms of efficiency and resource use. The ramps were made of mud brick and limestone chippings, and as the pyramid grew taller, so did the ramps. Picture a never-ending construction zone with a cacophony of workers shouting directions in ancient Egyptian. No GPS, no walkie-talkies, just the raw sound of human hustle. And here's the thing. Once a block was in place, it wasn't going anywhere. This was a one-time, no-refund, no-return policy. The precision with which these stones were laid is mind-boggling, with gaps between the stones being less than a millimeter. That's tighter than a hipster's skinny jeans. Now, let's talk about those so-called blueprints. The ancient Egyptians didn't leave behind any architectural plans or blueprints as we know them today. Instead, they relied on a combination of experience, oral tradition, and perhaps some rudimentary drawings. It's like building a skyscraper with nothing but a few sketches on a napkin. This wasn't because they were primitive, far from it. They had a deep understanding of mathematics and geometry, evident in the pyramid's alignment with true north and the precision of its angles. Clearly, they knew their stuff, but it does make you wonder. How many ancient architects went to bed at night, hoping they didn't mess up some crucial calculation? Despite the lack of formal blueprints, there was certainly a master plan of sorts, directed by a priestly architect or overseer. His job was to ensure that every stone was in its rightful place, and that the whole operation ran like a well-oiled chariot. We can imagine him standing at the top of the pyramid, surveying his domain, perhaps with a sense of divine purpose, or at least hoping his calculations would land him a cushy afterlife. Now, before you start imagining aliens descending from the skies to lend a hand or a tentacle, let's put that theory to rest. The idea that extraterrestrials built the pyramids is a fun sci-fi narrative, but it's about as historically accurate as a Hollywood epic. The truth is far more impressive. Human enterprise, ingenuity, and sheer determination were the real forces at work here. And what about those workers? Living conditions weren't exactly Club Med. They resided in makeshift camps near the construction site, and while they weren't slaves, their lives were far from leisurely. Archaeological evidence shows they had access to medical care, which, considering the heavy lifting, was probably a necessity rather than a luxury. Injuries were common, and the work was grueling, yet they were part of something monumental. The camaraderie and sense of purpose must have been palpable, a shared mission to honor the pharaoh and, by extension, the gods. Economically, this was a colossal undertaking. The resources required were staggering, and it's a testament to the Egyptian economy's robustness that they could support such an endeavor. The labor force was fed, clothed, and organized in a system that would make today's project managers nod in appreciation. The annual Nile floods ensured a steady supply of grain, which was crucial for feeding the workers. This was an economy built on agriculture, and the pyramids were its crowning glory. So, what does this tell us about ancient Egypt? For one, it was a society that could mobilize its resources on an unprecedented scale. It had a complex social structure that allowed for large-scale coordination and planning. The pyramids weren't just architectural feats. They were the embodiment of a civilization at its zenith, a testament to human ambition and the drive to leave a legacy carved in stone. And while the pyramids may have started as the grand vision of a single pharaoh, they became a collective achievement, a symbol of national pride and divine purpose. They were the ancient world's ultimate status symbol, a message to future generations that said, "We were here, we achieved greatness, and we did it all without a single alien." Stay with us as we continue to unravel the mysteries of pyramid construction, exploring the lives of those who built them and the legacy they left behind. There's more to this story than meets the eye, and as we delve deeper, we'll uncover the true marvels of this ancient wonder. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of the pyramid workforce, a saga that's less about whips and chains and more about sweat and skill. Forget the Hollywood image of enslaved masses toiling under a tyrant's gaze. The reality is more fascinating and, dare I say, a bit more civilized. These were no mere peons. These workers were the unsung heroes of their time, and they certainly didn't sign up for a vacation. First off, let's tackle the myth of slave labor. The workers who built the pyramids weren't enslaved in the traditional sense. Many were conscripted, sure, but others volunteered for the gig. Why? Well, besides the patriotic duty and spiritual incentives, building a pharaoh's eternal abode was like scoring eternal brownie points with the gods. They got perks. Think of them as the first-ever employee benefits package, ancient Egyptian style. Now, don't mistake this for an all-expenses-paid trip to the Nile. The work was grueling, no question, but these folks had skills that were highly prized. Stonecutters, for instance, were the rock stars of the operation. Armed with copper tools that would make modern-day DIY enthusiasts weep, they chiseled away with precision that boggles the mind. I mean, who knew copper could do that? These guys were the original masters of their craft, the Michelangelos of limestone. And then there were the engineers, the brains behind the brawn. These were the ancient world's project managers, minus the spreadsheets and endless Zoom calls. They orchestrated the logistics, ensuring that each 25-ton block found its place in the grand scheme of things. Their understanding of geometry and alignment was spot on, literally. The precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment with the cardinal points is so accurate, it puts our GPS systems to shame. Living conditions for the workforce weren't exactly luxurious, but they weren't too shabby given the era. Archaeological digs at the workers' village reveal long dormitories, bakeries, and even breweries. Because, let's be honest, bread and beer weren't just sustenance. They were morale boosters. These ancient carbs were the fuel that kept the workforce moving, much like your morning coffee or evening glass of wine. The diet of these workers was surprisingly balanced. Besides bread and beer, they enjoyed veggies, garlic, and onions, a veritable feast compared to the gruel you might expect. Meat was on the menu too, albeit sparingly, reserved for special occasions or as a reward for hard work. Picture a worker's feast after setting a particularly challenging stone, a celebratory roast that was both a physical and spiritual reward. And let's not forget healthcare. Yes, you heard that right, healthcare in ancient Egypt. Workers had access to medical care, evidenced by remains showing healed injuries. Imagine an ancient HMO where doctors, more like early-day paramedics, treated wounds with honey, nature's antiseptic, and herbs. It's like a wellness program, ancient style. And given the risks of hauling giant stones, this was as much a necessity as a perk. Socially, these workers were a mixed bag of backgrounds, drawn from all over Egypt. They lived in a community that was both highly organized and surprisingly egalitarian for its time. They had hierarchies, sure, but camaraderie was the glue that held them together. Imagine a bustling construction site, a chorus of ancient Egyptian banter, with everyone working toward a common goal. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission with a spiritual kick. The economic context of pyramid building was monumental. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a national endeavor that mobilized resources on a scale that would make modern economists gawk. The state provided the essentials, food, tools, materials, funded by the agricultural bounty of the Nile. This wasn't just an investment in a pharaoh's afterlife. It was an investment in the economy itself, a way to keep the machinery of society well-oiled. Politically, this was the era of Pharaoh Khufu, the man with the grand vision. His absolute power allowed him to conscript labor and resources, but it also meant he had to keep the workforce motivated and content. A happy worker is a productive worker, after all. This was a society built on the backs of its people, and Khufu knew he had to walk the tightrope between divine authority and practical leadership. So, what's the takeaway here? The people who built the pyramids were skilled workers, part of an organized society that valued their contribution. They weren't slaves, but dedicated laborers with a sense of purpose. They were part of something bigger than themselves, a legacy that would outlast them by millennia. Their lives weren't easy, but they weren't as grim as the myths would have you believe. And as for those myths, they persist because they're tantalizing, a simple narrative of oppression and grandeur. But the truth is, as always, more complex and infinitely more interesting. The pyramids weren't just the product of a despot's whim, but of a civilization at its zenith, a testament to human enterprise and ingenuity. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the ancient world's most colossal construction project. There's more to uncover, more stories to tell, and more myths to bust. Because history, like those pyramids, is built layer by layer, and we're just getting started. As we dive deeper into the enigma of Egypt's pyramids, let's tackle the question everyone loves to speculate about. What were these towering stone behemoths really for? Sure, you might think they were just the world's most extravagant tombstones, like those massive granite, "I was here," moments for pharaohs. But hang on to your hieroglyphs, because the truth is a bit more cosmic than that. First off, let's talk about the religious significance. The pyramids weren't just about death, they were about rebirth. Think of them as ancient launch pads to eternity. The Egyptians were obsessed, absolutely fixated, with the afterlife. In their view, life after death wasn't just a sequel, it was the main event. The pyramids served as celestial staircases, guiding the souls of the pharaohs to the afterlife, where they'd cozy up with the gods. And not just any gods, Ra, the sun god, was the big man on campus. The pharaohs believed they'd join him on his daily cruise across the sky, ensuring the sun would rise and set for eternity. Talk about a celestial timeshare. But wait, there's more. The pyramids were meticulously aligned with celestial bodies. No small feat, considering they didn't have telescopes or Google Maps. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, is oriented almost perfectly with the cardinal points. Its sides align within a fraction of a degree to true north. How's that for ancient precision? This alignment wasn't just for show. It was a cosmic compass, a testament to the Egyptians' understanding of the universe and their place within it. Now, let's debunk the myth that these were just tombs for the rich and famous. Sure, pharaohs were interred here, but the pyramids were part of a much grander architectural ambition. They were the centerpieces of vast complexes that included temples, causeways, and smaller pyramids for queens. These complexes were bustling hubs of worship and administration. They were the ancient equivalent of a company headquarters, complete with an R&D department. Except instead of developing new products, they were perfecting the art of mummification and planning for the afterlife. And what about the art and hieroglyphs that adorned these structures? These weren't just pretty pictures. They were survival manuals for eternity. The walls of the pyramids and their surrounding structures were inscribed with spells, invocations, and scenes of daily life. The pyramid texts, found in the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties, are some of the oldest religious writings in existence. They were essentially cheat sheets for the afterlife, guiding the pharaoh through the perils of the underworld and helping him attain divine status. It's like having a GPS for the soul, rerouting you past the cosmic traffic jams to ensure you reach your final destination. The art wasn't just functional, it was also deeply symbolic. Scenes of the pharaoh hunting, fishing, and farming weren't just snapshots of royal hobbies. They symbolized the pharaoh's role as a provider and protector, his divine duty to maintain cosmic order and balance. Every brushstroke, every chisel mark, was a prayer for continuity, a plea to the gods to keep the world turning just as it always had. Of course, the grand architectural ambition behind these projects can't be overstated. The pyramids were feats of engineering that still baffle modern architects. Their construction demanded not only brute strength, but also sophisticated knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. The Egyptians achieved an almost unfathomable level of precision, and they did it all without the benefit of cranes, power tools, or even the humble wheel. Talk about going above and beyond, literally. Economically, these architectural masterpieces were massive investments. They were funded by the agricultural surplus generated by the fertile Nile Delta. This was a society that knew how to leverage its natural resources to support large-scale projects. The pyramids weren't just religious and political statements. They were economic powerhouses, driving trade and innovation. They showcased Egypt's wealth and stability, a stone-and-mortar reminder of the kingdom's might. Politically, the pyramids were symbols of centralized power. They demonstrated the pharaoh's divine mandate and his ability to mobilize the nation's resources. But they also served as a reminder of the social contract between the ruler and the ruled. While the pharaoh demanded labor and tribute, he was also responsible for maintaining order and prosperity. The pyramids were a physical manifestation of this delicate balance, a colossal promise that the pharaoh would ensure the sun would rise each day and the Nile would flood each year. So what's the real story here? The pyramids were more than just tombs. They were the axis mundi of the Egyptian universe. They weren't just about commemorating death. They were about celebrating life, both the temporal and the eternal. They were symbols of power, faith, and the enduring human desire to touch the divine. They were the ancient world's ultimate flex, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of immortality. And as we continue our journey through the sands of time, remember that these ancient stones have stories to tell, stories that are as rich and complex as the civilization that built them. We're only just beginning to uncover the layers of meaning behind these monumental structures, and there's so much more to explore. Stay with us as we delve deeper into the intriguing world of pyramid construction, where every stone has a tale to tell, and every myth has a kernel of truth waiting to be unearthed. So, as we wrap up this epic journey through the sands of time, let's take a moment to ponder the monumentality of these pyramids. They weren't just an exercise in stacking stones. They were ancient Egypt's ultimate power move, a definitive "we were here," etched into the annals of history. But what is it about these towering wonders that continue to captivate our imaginations thousands of years later? Why do they still stand as symbols of human ambition and ingenuity, casting a long shadow over our modern world? First off, let's talk legacy. These pyramids set the gold standard for architectural ambition. They were the blueprint, literally and figuratively, for monumental building projects that followed. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you'll see their influence in the grand cathedrals of Europe, where stone was once again used to reach toward the heavens. Not a dame, anyone. These structures, much like the pyramids, weren't just about function. They were about making a statement, both spiritual and political. And let's not forget the modern skyscraper, the urban descendant of the ancient pyramid, reaching ever skyward in a continual quest for height and prestige. The pyramids were more than just a feat of engineering. They were a testament to what a civilization could achieve when it marshaled its resources and focused on a singular, glorious goal. These structures were like the ancient world's version of a Kickstarter project, except instead of funding the latest gadget, they crowdfunded immortality. The Egyptians poured their agricultural surplus, manpower, and creativity into these stone giants, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the last pharaoh had been mummified and tucked away. Now, let's tackle the cultural impact. The pyramids have woven themselves into the very fabric of modern pop culture. Movies, books, and video games have all tapped into the allure of these ancient wonders. Whether it's Indiana Jones dodging booby traps or Lara Croft solving ancient puzzles, the pyramids serve as the quintessential backdrop for adventure and mystery. And who could forget the iconic image of alien spaceships hovering over Giza in every other sci-fi flick? The pyramids are like the Hollywood A-listers of antiquity, guaranteed to draw a crowd and spark the imagination. But here's the kicker. What if ancient Egypt had access to modern technology? Picture this. Pharaoh Khufu with a smartphone, barking orders via text instead of shouting across the desert. Sure, they wouldn't have needed Wi-Fi in the middle of Giza. Netflix wasn't a priority when you're building a stairway to the stars. But imagine the possibilities. GPS for aligning those pesky cardinal points, drones for aerial surveys, even 3D printing for those intricate carvings. The mind boggles at the thought. Yet, there's something wonderfully human about achieving all this without a single byte of data. The pyramids remind us of what we can accomplish with grit, determination, and a little bit of ingenuity. They were built on human sweat and skill, not silicon chips and algorithms. In an age where technology often does the heavy lifting, the pyramids stand as a timeless reminder of the power of human endeavor. Economically, the legacy of the pyramids is just as monumental as the structures themselves. They were the ancient world's ultimate public works project, driving technological and administrative advancements. The need to organize labor, manage resources, and execute complex plans laid the groundwork for future economic systems. They were, in essence, a masterclass in logistics and project management, a lesson in how to turn a vision into reality with nothing more than a chisel, some ingenuity, and a whole lot of elbow grease. Politically, these structures were the ultimate expression of the pharaoh's divine authority. They were colossal reminders of the social contract between the ruler and the ruled, a stone manifesto of power that could weather the sands of time. Even today, they stand as symbols of unyielding ambition, a testament to the lengths we'll go to leave our mark on the world. So, what's the final takeaway here? The pyramids are more than just ancient tombs. They're a celebration of life, ambition, and the relentless human spirit. They speak to our desire to reach beyond the mundane and touch the divine, to create something that will outlast us and tell our story to future generations. In a world where everything seems fleeting, the pyramids offer a reassuring reminder of permanence and legacy. As we close the book on this exploration, let's remember that the story of the pyramids is also a story about us, about the dreams we dare to dream and the heights we strive to reach. They are a testament to what we can achieve when we set our sights on the stars, and they invite us to ponder what other wonders we might create if we harness the same ambition and ingenuity. So the next time you gaze upon these ancient wonders, remember, they're not just relics of the past, they're beacons for the future. And who knows, maybe one day we'll be building our own pyramids, perhaps not out of stone, but out of the dreams and aspirations that continue to propel us forward. In the grand theatre of ancient history, where civilizations rose and fell like a game of high-stakes Monopoly, the Phoenicians were the ultimate maritime mavericks. Imagine a civilization that could teach Jeff Bezos a thing or two about expanding an empire across the seas. These folks weren't just floating around in glorified bathtubs. They were the Silicon Valley of shipbuilding. Operating from a skinny sliver of land along the eastern Mediterranean coast, now modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians took a lemon of a landscape and squeezed it into a lemonade stand that spanned continents. To start with, Phoenicians were the kind of sea-savvy merchants who could have sold sand to a desert. They were the first to teach the world that if you're not selling or trading, you're missing out on half of life's adventures. Their ships were the FedEx of the ancient world, and they were in the business of delivering everything from the mundane to the luxurious. Timber, textiles, glass, and the oh-so-famous Tyrian purple dye, the kind of purple that screamed, "I'm too fancy for you," and was reserved for the elite who could handle the price tag that rivaled a small country's GDP. Now, let's get into the geographical nitty-gritty. The Phoenicians' homeland wasn't exactly the plushest real estate on the Med. Hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other, they had little choice but to look seawards. It's a bit like finding yourself in a crowded elevator and deciding your best option is to climb out through the ceiling. So, with virtually no farmland to speak of, they took the lemons of land scarcity and turned them into a sea-based empire. This necessity-driven ingenuity was their secret sauce. Speaking of secret sauces, let's talk about the ships. Phoenician vessels had hulls that were as sleek as a sports car and as sturdy as a tank. They developed the galley ship with rows of oars and a single mast which allowed for speed and maneuverability, basically the ancient equivalent of a Ferrari. These ships could navigate the tricky waters of the Mediterranean with aplomb, hugging coastlines, and even daring to brave the open sea when needed. The Phoenicians didn't have GPS, but they did have an impressive knowledge of astronomy and the ability to read the stars like an ancient Google Maps. Their navigational skills were so advanced that they could probably find their way out of IKEA without a map. But why, you might ask, was all this seafaring prowess important? It's simple. Control the sea, and you control trade. Control trade, and you control wealth. Control wealth, and well, you get the picture. The Phoenicians spread their influence by establishing colonies, the most famous being Carthage in North Africa. Yes, Carthage, the same city that would later give Rome a run for its money. It's almost poetic how the student tried to outdo the master, but that's a story for another day. Phoenician commerce was not just about trading goods, it was about trading ideas, culture, and technology. They were cultural couriers, and their alphabet, which they passed on to the Greeks, would eventually become the precursor to our modern alphabets. Imagine a time when writing wasn't a given, and then imagine the Phoenicians coming along and saying, "Hey, let's make this easier." They turned complex cuneiform scripts into a streamlined alphabet that was user-friendly enough to be learned over a weekend course. Yet, for all their achievements, the Phoenicians didn't leave behind grandiose monuments or self-aggrandizing inscriptions. They were less about boasting and more about business. They were like that low-key wealthy neighbor with a beat-up car who secretly owns half the block. Their legacy is in the trade routes they charted and the cultural footprints they left behind across the Mediterranean. In sum, the Phoenicians didn't just float on the sea, they mastered it. They took a narrow strip of land and turned it into a launch pad for a commercial empire that would have made even the hardiest of pirates green with envy. Their story is not just a tale of trade and navigation, but a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. So next time you're using your GPS or enjoying a glass of wine from a far-off land, give a nod to these ancient mariners who, quite literally, set the course for the world to follow. Now, let's dive headfirst into the treasure trove that was the Phoenician economy. These ancient traders had a knack for turning everyday items into gold mines. First up, we have the Tyrian purple dye, a color so exclusive that it made Versailles look like a budget hotel. Extracted from the glands of the murex snail, it took thousands of these slimy little critters to dye just one garment. To put it into perspective, a pound of this dye was worth more than its weight in gold, making it the kind of luxury that would make even the Kardashians blush. Royalty and the elite of the day flaunted it as a status symbol. After all, if you weren't wearing purple, were you even living? But dye wasn't the only thing these maritime merchants had up their sleeves. The Phoenicians were also the glassblowers par excellence of the ancient world. Long before your favorite artisanal glassware shop opened up downtown, the Phoenicians were perfecting techniques that would revolutionize how people lived. They crafted everything from simple containers to elaborate art pieces, proving that glass wasn't just for windows, it was for lifestyle upgrades. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill, moss-covered, three-handled family credenza. It was cutting-edge technology. And speaking of cutting-edge, their glass was in such high demand that it was practically the iPhone of its day. Everyone wanted it, and not everyone could afford it. Now, let's talk logistics, because what good is having luxury goods if you can't get them to market? The Phoenicians were the original masters of the supply chain, their ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean like ancient Amazon Prime. They established trading routes that would make a spider's web look straightforward. From the Levantan coast, they ventured westward to Cyprus and Crete, north to Anatolia and Greece, south to Egypt, and westward again to the coasts of North Africa and Spain. Their daring voyages even took them through the treacherous Strait of Gibraltar. Talk about having nerves of steel. And let's not forget the legendary tales of them reaching as far as Britain for tin, far before EasyJet made the trip a weekend getaway. But here's where we need to pump the brakes on the legend mobile. While it's tempting to imagine Phoenician sailors as fearless adventurers charting unknown waters, the reality is a bit more pragmatic. These guys weren't out to discover new worlds, they were out to make a buck. The routes they took were calculated, hugging coastlines and exploiting known ports to minimize risks. This wasn't a swashbuckling tale of exploration. It was a shrewd business model that prioritized profits over glory, a strategy that would make even the most MBA-savvy entrepreneur nod in approval. And let's not overlook the fact that these trade networks weren't just about moving goods. They were about moving ideas. The Phoenicians were cultural pollinators, spreading languages, religious practices, and technological innovations across continents. It's like they were running a TED Talk circuit, but instead of PowerPoints, they had amphoras full of goodies. Their alphabet, which was a streamlined version of the complex cuneiform scripts, spread like wildfire and laid the groundwork for the Greek and Latin alphabets. It's the kind of legacy that makes you realize writing that novel might be more achievable than you thought. If the Phoenicians could simplify writing for an entire civilization, surely you can tackle that blank page. Now, while we're on the topic of busting myths, let's address the so-called legendary ventures of the Phoenicians. There are tales of them circumnavigating Africa long before Vasco da Gama made it cool. Herodotus famously wrote about a Phoenician expedition sent by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, which supposedly sailed down the Red Sea, looped around the tip of Africa, and returned via the Strait of Gibraltar. However, the jury is still out on whether this actually happened, or if it's just ancient PR spun to make the Phoenicians seem even more epic than they already were. It's a bit like the ancient equivalent of claiming you ran a marathon when you actually just took a scenic walk. What we do know for sure is that the Phoenicians were incredibly savvy about marketing themselves. They managed to weave their narrative into the fabric of history, casting themselves as both indispensable traders and mysterious adventurers. It's a neat trick that's kept historians debating for centuries. Were they really the fearless navigators some sources claim? Or were they just incredibly smart businessmen with a flair for storytelling? Either way, the Phoenicians managed to cement their place in history without needing to carve their names into stone. They left us with stories, trade routes, and an alphabet that would shape the future. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth its weight in Tyrian purple. As we sail onward in this tale of ancient trade, keep in mind the Phoenicians' ability to turn obstacles into opportunities. They navigated a world of limited resources and fierce competition with a blend of cunning, creativity, and a bit of that ancient razzle-dazzle. So, next time you find yourself in a tight spot, ask yourself, what would a Phoenician do? With any luck, you'll find a way to spin your own version of Tyrian purple from whatever snail's life throws at you. While the Phoenicians were busy spinning their Tyrian purple and navigating trade routes as if they had a subscription to ancient GPS monthly, back on land, the political scene was less serene waters and more stormy seas. Let's drop anchor in the bustling city-states of Tyre and Sidon, the Kardashian sisters of the ancient world, where sibling rivalry wasn't just a family squabble. It was a full-blown maritime drama. Imagine Tyre and Sidon as two Mediterranean powerhouses vying for the spotlight. Tyre, the bold and brash, was like the flashy celebrity with a penchant for grand gestures. Meanwhile, Sidon played the role of the sophisticated elder sibling, quietly influential but never shy of a little palace intrigue. Both cities were like two rival tech giants, each trying to outdo the other with the latest maritime innovations and trade conquests. But let's not romanticize this too much. If you think modern politics is a circus, ancient Phoenicia was the whole carnival. There were no democratic debates or peaceful transitions of power. Instead, it was a roller coaster of alliances, betrayals, and occasional invasions. Tyre and Sidon were constantly scheming, forming alliances with regional powers like Egypt or Assyria, only to flip the script when a better deal came along. Picture a game of Risk, but with actual stakes and a lot more shouting in Phoenician. Take, for example, the time when Sidon, perhaps feeling a bit too comfortable in its robes of purple, decided to cozy up to the Assyrians. This wasn't just a dinner party invitation. It was a strategic move to gain protection and a leg up against Tyre. But alliances in the ancient world were as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. When the Assyrians decided to tighten their grip, Sidon quickly realized that it had invited a vampire to its blood bank. The city attempted to rebel, only to be swiftly reminded that Assyrian hospitality often came with a side of obliteration. Meanwhile, Tyre was playing its own game of chess, often positioning itself as the rebellious underdog. They were the ones who would throw shade at Assyria, only to turn around and strike a deal with Egypt. It was a complex web of diplomacy that would make Machiavelli proud, or at least slightly envious. Tyre's strategy was all about leveraging its maritime prowess to maintain autonomy, even when surrounded by empires that wouldn't mind adding a little Phoenician coastline to their portfolios. But while the elite navigated these political maelstroms, the everyday Phoenician wasn't exactly living the life of luxury. The socio-economic divide was as wide as a Phoenician galley was long. Merchant princes and their families enjoyed the spoils of trade, adorning themselves in exotic silks and indulging in imported wines that would make a modern sommelier weep with envy. Meanwhile, the average Joe Phoenician was probably more concerned with whether he'd have enough grain to last the winter than with the latest diplomatic scandal. These social dynamics weren't just a footnote. They were the iceberg beneath the Phoenician ship of state. While the elite strutted about in their imported finery, the labourers and craftsmen kept the economic engine running. It's the classic case of the 1% versus the 99, but with a lot more wooden ships and a bit less Wall Street. The merchants got richer, and the labourers, well, they just kept labouring, carving out a living from the sea and the scant resources of the land. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these inequities, the Phoenicians managed to create a society that was resilient and remarkably cohesive. The merchant elite needed the craftsmen to build their ships and produce their goods, just as the craftsmen depended on the merchants to sell their wares across the known world. It was a symbiotic relationship that, while unequal, was crucial to the success of Phoenician trade. And let's not forget the cultural exchanges that were happening beneath the surface. As Phoenician ships docked in foreign ports, they didn't just unload goods, they shared ideas, stories, and traditions. This cultural mingling was the social media of the ancient world, a way for disparate cultures to connect and influence one another without needing a Wi-Fi password. But all this social and political maneuvering wasn't without its risks. The Phoenicians might have been skilled sailors and traders, but they were also living in a world where one misstep could mean disaster. The very alliances that protected them could just as easily turn against them, and the same trade routes that brought them wealth could bring danger in the form of piracy or hostile takeovers. In the end, the Phoenician story is a testament to the delicate balance of power, ambition, and necessity. They were masters of adaptation, able to pivot strategies with the same ease as they could sail their ships. They navigated not just the waters of the Mediterranean, but also the treacherous tides of politics and social dynamics. As we continue this journey into the world of the Phoenicians, keep in mind that beneath the surface of every trade agreement and political alliance lies a complex web of human ambition, fear, and ingenuity. And that, my friends, is a tale as old as time itself. And speaking of tales as old as time, let's dive into the murky waters of Phoenician exploration myth. Did these ancient sailors really circumnavigate Africa, or is that just the sort of story you tell around a dinner table to impress your in-laws? Let's grab our ancient investigative hats and sift through the seaweed of history to find the pearls of truth. First up, we have the infamous claim by Herodotus, the Greek historian who was part storyteller, part historian, and maybe part clickbait writer. According to him, around 600 BCE, Pharaoh Necho II commissioned Phoenician sailors to embark on a grand voyage to circle Africa. The story goes that these seafarers set sail from the Red Sea, ventured southward hugging the coast, and after a long, arduous journey, popped out on the other side via the Strait of Gibraltar like it was no biggie. They even supposedly reported that during the trip the sun was on their right, hinting they might have crossed into the southern hemisphere. Sounds impressive, right? But let's pump the brakes on this ancient nautical epic. While it's a tantalizing tale, historians are divided on its authenticity. For one, there's no archaeological evidence to back up this claim, which might make you think twice before accepting it as gospel truth. Plus, the technology of the time was, let's face it, more about surviving the journey rather than conquering it. The Phoenicians were certainly seasoned sailors, but navigating the perilous waters around the African continent would have been a monumental feat, akin to driving a Model T Ford through a Formula One race. In reality, the Phoenicians were the ultimate pragmatists. They were all about the bottom line. Risks were calculated, and voyages were planned with precision. Their ships hugged coastlines like a toddler clinging to their parent's leg on the first day of school. The idea of them venturing into the largely uncharted and treacherous waters of the open ocean is a bit like picturing someone attempting to bake a soufflé without knowing what an oven is. Now, don't let this dose of reality dull the allure of Phoenician legends. These stories served a purpose beyond pure historical record. They were ancient marketing campaigns, enhancing the mystique of a culture that thrived on its enigmatic reputation. By spinning tales of daring adventures, the Phoenicians positioned themselves not just as traders, but as the adventurers of the ancient world, much like how modern brands sell not just a product, but a lifestyle. While we may debunk the myth of circumnavigation, there's no denying the cultural exchanges that their real voyages facilitated. As their ships docked in distant lands, they weren't just offloading goods. They were cultural ambassadors, spreading ideas and innovations like a maritime TED talk circuit. They traded everything from the famous Tyrian purple to glassware, but they also traded cultural capital, influencing everything from language to local customs. Take, for instance, the Phoenician alphabet. It was a game changer, the ancient world's equivalent of open-source software. Simple, accessible, and revolutionary, it spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean, influencing the Greek and Latin alphabets, which in turn shaped the script you're reading right now. It's like the Phoenicians were the original IT department, debugging the complex cuneiform code and rolling out a user-friendly update that everyone could get on board with. Beyond language, Phoenician influence seeped into luxury goods and fashion trends. They were the influencers of their day, dictating what's in, from the luxury textiles they traded to the elaborate jewelry designs they introduced. The Phoenicians didn't just sell products. they sold prestige. Wearing Phoenician textiles or using their glassware was like having the latest designer bag or the newest tech gadget. It signaled status and sophistication. But let's not sugarcoat the cultural exchange process. It wasn't all perfumed letters and trade agreements sealed with a handshake. The spread of ideas also involved a fair bit of cultural appropriation and adaptation, with local cultures picking and choosing what they liked from the Phoenician offerings and discarding the rest. It was a two-way street, with influences bouncing back and forth like a game of cultural ping-pong. And all this trading and cultural exchange happened against a backdrop of political maneuvering and social dynamics that would make a modern soap opera seem tame. As Phoenician ships sailed into new ports, they weren't just looking for new markets. They were looking for new allies, new opportunities, and sometimes a quick escape route from whatever political upheaval was brewing back home. So, while the Phoenicians might not have conquered the oceans in the way legends suggest, they undoubtedly conquered the ancient world's marketplace of ideas and goods. Their legacy is not in the monuments they left behind, but in the cultural and economic currents that continue to ripple through history. They were the ultimate networkers, leveraging their maritime prowess to connect disparate cultures, spread innovations, and whether by myth or fact, sail into the annals of history as both legendary traders and savvy businessmen. As we prepare to dive deeper into the final chapter of their story, remember that the Phoenicians were masters of making the most of what they had. They spun a web of trade and influence that stretched far beyond their tiny homeland, proving that sometimes the smallest stones make the biggest ripples. So next time you catch yourself mythologizing the past, take a leaf out of the Phoenician playbook, question the legend, but appreciate the ingenuity behind it. But let's not get too caught up in the romance of it all. While the Phoenicians were busy shaping the ancient world, the sands of time were shifting beneath them. As influential as they were, even these maritime maestros couldn't outrun the inexorable march of history. Enter the rising powers of Greece and Rome, stage left, with a swagger that would make even a Phoenician merchant sit up and take notice. You see, by the time the Greeks and Romans were flexing their imperial muscles, the Phoenicians found themselves in a bit of a pickle. Imagine being the cool kid in school, only for a new student to show up with a killer wardrobe and a penchant for empire building. The Phoenicians, once the undisputed rulers of the Mediterranean trade routes, were suddenly caught between a rock and a hard place, or more accurately, between a toga and a Grecian urn. Let's start with the Greeks, those philosophical wunderkinds who were as fond of conquering as they were of contemplating the nature of existence. By the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great was on a mission to spread Hellenistic culture like it was the latest TikTok trend. His campaign against Tyre in 332 BCE was a landmark moment, not just for the Macedonian Empire, but for the Phoenicians as well. Alexander laid siege to Tyre for a grueling 7 months, eventually breaching its defenses and solidifying Greek dominance in the region. It was a stark reminder that, in the grand chessboard of empires, even the most strategic of players can find themselves checkmated. But wait, as they say in infomercials, there's more. The Romans were waiting in the wings, eager to take center stage. They were the bullies on the block, and by the 3rd century BCE, they had set their sights on the Phoenician jewel of Carthage. Cue the Punic Wars, a series of 3 epic clashes between Rome and Carthage that spanned over a century. It was like a heavyweight boxing match, but with more elephants and fewer rules. The First Punic War kicked off in 264 BCE, and after 23 years of naval skirmishes and tactical maneuvers, Rome emerged victorious, seizing control of Sicily. The Second Punic War saw the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal crossing the Alps with his war elephants in a bold move that still captures imaginations today. Despite his initial successes, Hannibal ultimately couldn't deliver a knockout blow to Rome. The Third Punic War, meanwhile, was less of a war and more of a demolition job. In 146 BCE, Rome laid waste to Carthage, leveling the city and effectively ending Phoenician maritime dominance. Talk about a harsh reality check. For the Phoenicians, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Their once mighty trade networks and seafaring supremacy were eclipsed by the sheer military might of Rome. It's a sobering reminder that in the world of geopolitics, even the most innovative and enterprising societies can be outpaced by brute force. Yet, despite their decline as a political power, the Phoenicians left an indelible mark on the world. Their influence can be seen in the very fabric of modern society. Take their alphabet, for example. It's the great-granddaddy of the scripts we use today. That's right. Every time you jot down a grocery list or draft an email, you're channeling a bit of Phoenician ingenuity. And let's not forget their contributions to navigation. The Phoenicians charted the stars and mapped the winds, laying the groundwork for future explorers who would dare to venture beyond the horizon. Moreover, the Phoenicians' spirit of cultural exchange lives on. They were the original globalists, crisscrossing the Mediterranean and beyond, spreading ideas and goods with abandon. In an age where cultural exchange is more important than ever, their legacy serves as a testament to the power of connectivity and collaboration. So, while the Phoenicians may not have erected grand monuments or left behind towering pyramids, their legacy is no less monumental. They were the unsung heroes of the ancient world, quietly weaving the threads of commerce and culture that would shape civilizations for millennia. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest impacts are made not by the loudest voices, but by those who understand the art of subtlety and the power of a well-placed sail. As we bring this tale to a close, let's raise a metaphorical glass, or maybe an amphora, to the Phoenicians. They were the trailblazers who set sail into uncharted waters with nothing but the stars to guide them and the promise of discovery to spur them onward. Their story is one of resilience, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. So next time you find yourself feeling stuck or overwhelmed, channel your inner Phoenician and remember, there's always a way forward, even if you have to chart it yourself. In the bustling streets of 13th century Venice, where the scent of salt water mingled with the aroma of freshly caught fish and merchant chatter, was the local soundtrack. Marco Polo was busy doing what most teenagers do best, dreaming of adventure while probably annoying his elders. But this wasn't just any adolescent fantasy fueled by imaginative tales. Marco was practically born with wanderlust in his veins, courtesy of the Polo family's illustrious trading business that stretched its fingers as far as Constantinople and beyond. Now, let's dive into the Polo family album, shall we? Marco's father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffi, were the kind of entrepreneurs who'd give today's Silicon Valley venture capitalists a run for their money. These guys were pioneers of the Silk Road, not with the click of a mouse, but with months of perilous journeys involving camels and dodging bandits. They didn't just trade spices and silk. They spun stories that made Marco's imagination dance like the flames in a Venetian hearth. The economic backdrop of this era was a bit like a medieval stock exchange, minus the LED tickers and caffeine-fueled brokers. Venice was the Wall Street of the Middle Ages, dealing in goods so exotic that they might as well have been unicorn horns. Spices, silks, and precious stones were the Bitcoin of Marco's time, and the Polo family was dealing in the finest blockchain of the 13th century. Marco was born in 1254, and by the time he was 17, he'd become the ultimate travel influencer, minus the Instagram account. His father and uncle returned from their journeys with tales of a distant land ruled by the mighty Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who was basically the Jeff Bezos of Asia, if Bezos had an empire spanning millions of square miles. The Polo brothers' tales were the kind of stories that could make a young man's heart race and his feet itch for the road. In 1271, the Polo family decided to embark on the mother of all road trips, a journey to the east that would put even the most ambitious of today's backpackers to shame. They weren't just packing their bags with a couple of changes of clothes and a toothbrush. No, they were prepared for a journey that would take years, not hours, and involve crossing treacherous terrains, where a wrong turn could lead you to a band of marauding nomads rather than a cozy airbnb. Now, traveling in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly a walk in the park, or a stroll through the Venetian canals. For that matter, The logistics of such a journey were a nightmare even for the most seasoned traveler. There were no maps apps, no Yelp reviews of the best inns, and definitely no travel insurance. Instead, they had guidebooks written in Latin and local dialects, and their version of a GPS was the stars. If you think layovers today are painful, try waiting out a Mongol raid or a sandstorm in the Gobi Desert. And don't even get started on the food. Marco and his family had to rely on dried provisions that would make modern-day MREs look like gourmet meals. But why make such a perilous journey in the first place? Well, aside from the obvious lure of profit, there was the promise of adventure and the chance to meet the man ruling the largest contiguous empire in history. Kublai Khan was said to be as curious about the West as the West was about him. He was keen on learning about Christianity and the wonders of the European world, even if it meant hearing about it from some scrappy merchants from Venice. So, with dreams of adventure clinking in their pockets like Venetian ducats, the Polo family set off. Their journey would eventually cover over 5,000 miles, taking them across the deserts of Persia, the snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush, and the vast steppes of Central Asia. It would be a saga filled with the sort of trials and tribulations that make a modern-day backpacking trip look like a weekend getaway. Marco Polo might have started as just another young Venetian with dreams bigger than his hometown, but his journey would catapult him into the annals of history. As the Polos made their way eastward, they would encounter cultures and peoples that no European had ever seen, or at least lived to tell about. And while the stories would eventually take on a life of their own, filled with mythical creatures and fantastical elements, at the heart of it all was a young man's quest to see the world and bring back stories that would captivate generations to come. And so, Marco's tale begins not just as the story of one man, but as a window into a world of unimaginable distance and difference, of cultural clashes and connections. It's a tale that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, and let's face it, the Middle Ages had its fair share of those, curiosity and a good dose of Venetian pluck can light the way to discoveries that change the world. As we follow Marco on his journey, we'll find that the line between legend and reality is as hazy as the desert horizon he crossed so many years ago. And so, Marco Polo's epic trek was underway, setting the stage for one of history's most legendary journeys. The Polo family was no ordinary band of travelers. They were like the rock stars of the trade routes, minus the groupies and platinum records. This was the Middle Ages, after all, where even the most glamorous of adventures were more grit than glitter. As the Polos ventured through the Middle East, they encountered a kaleidoscope of cultures that would make a United Nations assembly look like a neighborhood block party. Each stop along the way was like flipping through a vivid travel magazine, if that magazine also included tips on avoiding robbers and surviving sandstorms. This wasn't just a leisurely jaunt. It was an odyssey through a world where your survival kit included not just provisions, but a hefty dose of luck. Their route led them through the bustling bazaars of the Middle East, where the air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, and the chatter of traders speaking a Tower of Babel's worth of languages. You could practically smell the turmeric and hear the haggling from across the centuries. Here, in the markets of Baghdad and beyond, the Polos witnessed commerce at its most vibrant, a medieval version of Wall Street, minus the suits and electronic tickers. Economically, the stakes were sky-high. The Polo family wasn't just in it for the Instagram-worthy sunsets over the desert dunes. They were chasing the kind of profits that could make or break a merchant's legacy. The goods they sought, silks, spices, and precious stones, were like the blue-chip stocks of their day. A successful trade could ensure wealth for generations, while a misstep could mean ruin. But let's not romanticize the Silk Road too much. Sure, it sounds glamorous, like the kind of place where you might expect to find Aladdin and his magic carpet. The reality, less Disney, more gritty survival. The Silk Road was a network of routes that wound through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The Polos had to deal with dodgy camel dealers who were the equivalent of today's used car salesmen. Only their vehicles spat and kicked. Then there were the geopolitical tensions. a constant undercurrent in the Polo's journey. The Middle East of the 13th century was a patchwork of territories controlled by various empires and factions, each with its own interests and agendas. Navigating these political waters required diplomacy and a keen sense of when to pay a bribe and when to negotiate. Think of it as a high-stakes game of chess, where each move was critical. The Polos didn't just travel through these lands, they had to understand them. This was a time when knowing the right dialect could mean the difference between being welcomed with open arms or being tossed out on your ear. Marco, ever the curious young man, soaked up languages like a sponge. By the time they reached the Persian Empire, Marco was already conversant in several languages, a skill that would serve him well throughout his travels. And let's not forget the sheer physical challenges. The road was long, and the journey was anything but comfortable. Forget cushy travel pillows and in-flight movies. The Polos were lucky if they could find a halfway decent inn or a safe spot to set up camp. They faced the kind of hardships that would make a modern-day backpacker clutch their Lonely Planet guidebook a little tighter. In the deserts of Persia, they encountered scorching heat by day and bone-chilling cold by night. Their mode of transport was the ever-reliable camel, though reliable might be a stretch when you're dealing with an animal known for its stubborn streak. The Polos navigated the harsh realities of medieval travel with the kind of grit that makes you appreciate the luxury of air conditioning and GPS. As they journeyed through this vast and varied landscape, the Polos were constantly reminded of the precarious balance between myth and reality. The Silk Road was a place of wonder and danger, where the allure of exotic lands was matched only by the perils that lurked around every corner. Bandits were a constant threat, and the Polos had to be ever vigilant, their swords as essential as their trade goods. Yet, despite the challenges, the Polos pressed on, driven by the promise of fortune and the thrill of discovery. Marco, in particular, was captivated by the diversity of the people and customs he encountered. Each new city, each new culture, was a chapter in the unfolding story of a world far larger and more varied than he had ever imagined. The Polo's journey through the Middle East was more than just a trade expedition. It was a cultural exchange that expanded their horizons and deepened their understanding of the world. They weren't just merchants. They were adventurers, diplomats, and storytellers, weaving a tapestry of experiences that would eventually captivate the Western imagination. As they continued their trek eastward, the Polos remained undeterred by the challenges that lay ahead. They had already crossed vast deserts and navigated complex political landscapes, and there were many more miles to go before they reached the court of Kublai Khan. But with each step they took, they were writing a new chapter in the history of exploration, a saga that would resonate through the ages. The Silk Road may have been a place of myth and mystery, but for the Polos, it was also a place of opportunity and adventure. They were pioneers in a world where the boundaries between legend and reality were as fluid as the sands of the desert. And as they journeyed further into the unknown, they carried with them the hopes and dreams of a young man who dared to see beyond the horizon. And so, with the dust of the ancient trade routes still clinging to their cloaks, the Polo family finally arrived at the court of Kublai Khan. Imagine a scene where the sheer scale of everything around you makes you feel like a tiny speck in a grand tapestry, and you're not even sure if you're part of the pattern. This was a place where opulence didn't just knock at the door, it kicked it down and threw a lavish party. Kublai Khan's empire was a gargantuan beast, stretching over 9 million square miles, making it the largest contiguous empire in history, a fact that would make even today's superpowers do a double take. The Khan himself was a man of immense wealth and power, ruling over a realm that included everything from the icy steppes of Siberia to the lush landscapes of Southeast Asia. Now, let's ditch the notion that Marco Polo was Kublai Khan's BFF, his right-hand man, or some sort of medieval Instagram influencer at court. Sure, Marco had his moment in the limelight, but the court was a bustling metropolis of intrigue, politics, and a touch of absurdity. Kublai Khan's court was like a reality show with higher stakes and less scripted drama. And while Polo wasn't exactly a court favorite, He did manage to secure a gig that made him more than just another face in the crowd. Marco was appointed as an envoy, essentially a fancy title for a guy who travelled extensively on behalf of the Khan. This role was less about fame and more about utility. His linguistic skills and knowledge of foreign cultures made him a valuable asset, like Google Translate with a heartbeat. But don't be fooled into thinking this was an easy job. Being an envoy meant navigating the treacherous web of Mongol politics, a task as delicate as balancing a stack of fine porcelain on a galloping horse. Kublai Khan's court itself was a spectacle of contradictions. Here you had the immense wealth of the empire on full display, a place where gold wasn't just a currency, but an aesthetic choice. Yet, the grandeur was often juxtaposed with the absurdities of medieval life. Take, for example, the Khan's penchant for elaborate feasts. We're talking hundreds of dishes, enough to make a modern-day buffet look like a modest snack spread. And while the Mongols were known for their hearty appetites, even they had moments when the culinary excesses bordered on the ludicrous. What about those tales of exotic animals parading through the court? Yes, Kublai Khan had a thing for exotic pets, but let's not exaggerate it to the point where it sounds like a medieval Noah's Ark on steroids. The menagerie was impressive, sure, but it was also a symbol of the Khan's power and reach. It was like having a fleet of private jets today, ostentatious, yes, but also a status symbol that said, "Look what I can do." It's easy to get swept up in the romance of Marco Polo's tales, imagining him as some kind of medieval James Bond, sipping kumis, a fermented mare's milk drink, while hobnobbing with the Mongol elite. But the reality was a bit more grounded. Marco was a cog in a much larger machine, a machine that was as complex as it was awe-inspiring. The cultural exchanges at court were real and significant, though. Marco's accounts brought news of the West to the East, and vice versa, creating a dialogue that transcended borders. He may not have been Kublai's confidant, but he was a bridge between worlds, a role that carried its own kind of prestige, even if it didn't come with a front-row seat next to the Khan. And let's talk about those myth-busting moments. Marco's stories have often been accused of embellishment, of painting a picture with a brush dipped in hyperbole. But while his accounts might have been colored with the hues of personal experience and imagination, they were rooted in the realities of a world that was as vast as it was varied. Kublai Khan's court was a stage upon which the dramas of empire played out, with Marco Polo as one of its many actors. His role was not that of a lead, but rather a supporting character who offered a unique perspective on the Mongol world. And while his tales have been debated, dissected, and sometimes dismissed, they remain a testament to the power of storytelling in bridging cultures and eras. Now, let's not pretend Marco was just a passive observer in this grand theatre. His travels as an envoy took him to places that most Europeans of his time could only dream of. From the bustling markets of Hangzhou, a city boasting nearly 1 million residents, to the remote reaches of the Mongol Empire, Marco witnessed firsthand the diversity and complexity of a world far larger than the maps of his homeland could convey. His accounts of paper money, postal systems, and the intricate bureaucracy of the Mongol administration were not just tales spun for the sake of entertainment. They were a window into a world that was, in many ways, more advanced than the Europe he had left behind. Imagine the surprise of a Venetian merchant learning that the Mongols had a postal system more efficient than anything Europe could muster. A medieval Amazon Prime, if you will, complete with express delivery. Marco's role in Kublai Khan's court was akin to that of an ambassador, albeit one who operated in the shadows of the grand political theatre. His contributions, while not headline-grabbing, were crucial in fostering understanding between East and West. His tales, whether embellished or not, served as a bridge across which ideas and innovations travelled, shaping the course of history in ways that Marco himself might never have imagined. As we delve deeper into Marco Polo's adventures, it's essential to keep a balanced perspective. His journey was a tapestry woven with threads of truth and fiction, of awe and absurdity. The court of Kublai Khan was a place where dreams and reality danced a complex tango. and Marco Polo was both a participant and a chronicler, capturing the essence of a world that was as fantastical as it was real. So, as we leave Marco at the court of Kublai Khan, navigating the intricate dance of diplomacy and discovery, we're reminded that history is often a blend of what was and what might have been. And while Marco Polo's tales have been questioned and critiqued, they endure as a testament to the power of curiosity and the human spirit's unyielding desire to explore the unknown. Stay tuned, because our journey with Marco is far from over, and the next leg of his adventure promises even more insights and intrigue. Fast forward to 1295, and Marco Polo was finally homeward bound, leaving behind the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court like a traveler reluctantly checking out of the world's most extravagant airbnb. But don't for a second think this was a simple return flight. Nope, Marco's journey back to Venice was a masterclass in medieval chaos theory. The Polos set sail from the Khan's realm with a fleet of 14 ships, which sounds impressive until you realize only a handful survived the grueling journey back. The sea was less a blue highway and more a ruthless gauntlet, where storms and scurvy were as common as overpriced airport snacks today. Of the hundreds who started the voyage, barely 20 made it to land. It was like the medieval version of Survivor, minus the immunity idols, but with plenty of unexpected detours. First stop, the island of Sumatra, where the Polos were delayed for 5 months due to monsoon season. Talk about a layover from hell. Imagine being stuck without a duty-free shop or airport lounge in sight, just constant rain and the pressing need to keep your provisions dry. If nothing else, this was a crash course in patience and improvisation. Eventually, the Polos made their way to the Persian Gulf, specifically the port of Hormuz, where tales of their voyage began to spread like wildfire. These weren't just idle merchant gossip. Marco's stories were the medieval equivalent of a Netflix binge, capturing the imaginations of anyone with an ear to lend. And why not? They were filled with exotic lands, wealth beyond measure, and enough adventure to make Indiana Jones look like a desk clerk. As Marco and his family finally approached Venice, a city that was less a hometown and more a buzzing hive of commerce and intrigue, they were unrecognizable. We're not just talking about a bit of facial hair and a tan. Try a full-on transformation from young adventurers to seasoned, world-weary veterans. They'd been gone for 24 years, long enough for a generation to grow up thinking that Polo was just a name on a milk carton. Venice, however, was as unpredictable as ever, embroiled in a war with Genoa that made their homecoming more of a baptism by fire. Tensions were high, and Marco soon found himself a prisoner of war, a twist that sounds like it was scripted by a particularly sadistic screenwriter. It was during his time in a Genoese prison that Marco dictated the tales of his travels to a fellow inmate, Rustichello de Pisa. Picture it, 2 guys in a cell spinning yarns that would eventually become The Travels of Marco Polo, a book that was part travelogue, part tall tale, and all sensational. Now, let's pause to debunk the notion that Marco's tales were universally believed. In a world where most folk rarely traveled beyond the next town over, stories of paper money and vast empires sounded like the ramblings of a madman. It was like telling a flat earther about the wonders of GPS. Marco's accounts were met with skepticism, envy, and sometimes downright disbelief. Yet they sparked an insatiable curiosity that would echo down the corridors of time. Marco's tales were also a goldmine of economic insights. His descriptions of the wealth and efficiency of the Mongol Empire, complete with its postal system and intricate trade networks, were revelations that made European merchants salivate like wolves at a medieval feast. The notion of a single currency, such as the paper money Marco described, was as revolutionary as the concept of credit cards would be centuries later. Back in Venice, Marco found himself a local legend, although his real legacy was more profound than just being the town's most famous raconteur. His stories, whether believed or not, reshaped European understanding of the East. They opened minds and inspired explorers like Christopher Columbus, who reportedly carried a copy of Polo's travels on his own voyages. Marco was like the original influencer, long before hashtags and social media algorithms took over. So, what was the real impact of Marco Polo's adventures? Economically, his tales fueled a desire for trade with Asia, setting the stage for the age of exploration. Politically, they highlighted the potential for powerful alliances and exchanges between vastly different cultures. And socially, they fueled the imaginations of countless Europeans, challenging them to look beyond the horizon and question what they knew of the world. But let's not get too starry-eyed. Marco's stories were also a lesson in the power of narrative. They demonstrated how tales, regardless of their truth, can shape perceptions and drive actions. Marco, whether knowingly or not, crafted a narrative that was part fact, part fiction, and all influential. As Marco settled back into Venetian life, he was likely oblivious to the full extent of his impact. He passed away in 1324, leaving behind a legacy that was both celebrated and scrutinized. His travels were a testament to the enduring power of curiosity and the human spirit's relentless drive to explore the unknown. The return of Marco Polo to Venice was more than just a homecoming. It was a pivotal moment in history. It marked the beginning of a new era of exploration and discovery, one that would eventually lead to the age of discovery and the reshaping of the global map. Marco's journey was a bridge between worlds, a connection between East and West that transcended the limits of geography and time. And as we prepare to delve into the final chapter of Marco Polo's story, let's remember that his adventures were more than just a travelogue. They were a catalyst for change, a spark that ignited a fire of exploration and curiosity that would burn for centuries to come. So, stay tuned, because the story of Marco Polo is far from over, and the next leg of our journey promises even more surprises and insights. As Marco Polo's story draws to a close, let's take a step back and peel away the layers of legend and hype, much like you'd strip a particularly stubborn artichoke. By the time Marco settled back in Venice, he was a walking, talking anomaly, a Venetian who had seen more of the world than most people could even imagine, and who had lived to tell about it. His tales, dictated to Rustichello de Pisa while he was imprisoned, eventually morphed into the Travels of Marco Polo, a text that would become the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster novel. Think Harry Potter, but with more camels and fewer wands. Now, let's talk about that book for a second. The Travels of Marco Polo was published around 1300 and quickly spread across Europe like a juicy piece of gossip in a small town. And just like any good gossip, it was met with a mix of fascination and skepticism. People lapped up the stories of distant lands and exotic cultures even as they rolled their eyes at the more fantastical elements. Was it all true? Probably not. Was it entertaining? Absolutely. Marco's account was a tapestry woven with threads of truth, half-truths, and outright embellishments. Take his descriptions of the great Khan's palace, for instance. Marco painted a picture of a palace so vast and opulent, it made the cathedrals of Europe look like quaint cottages. The reality. While Kublai Khan's court was undoubtedly grand, Marco's descriptions were likely dialed up to 11 to captivate his audience. After all, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? Despite the embellishments, the Travels of Marco Polo was a game-changer. It was like a medieval travel brochure that sparked the imaginations of future explorers. Christopher Columbus, for one, was so inspired that he reportedly carried a copy of Marco's book on his voyages, perhaps hoping to stumble upon the same riches and wonders that Marco described. It's as if Marco Polo handed Columbus a treasure map. Minus the marked X economically, the book fueled a burgeoning interest in trade with the East. Imagine European merchants reading about the wealth of the Mongol Empire and salivating at the thought of gold, silk, and spices. It was the original get-rich-quick scheme, though it came with the small print of potential death by scurvy or bandits. Politically, the Travels opened up discussions about potential alliances and exchanges, highlighting the possibilities that lay beyond Europe's borders. Socially, it challenged the people of Europe to think bigger and broader, to envision a world far more complex and interconnected than they had ever considered. But let's not forget the skeptics. Marco was nicknamed Il Maliani by some, a not-so-subtle jab at his tendency to sprinkle his stories with what they considered a million lies. His tales of paper money, for instance, probably sounded as plausible as unicorns tap-dancing down the streets of Venice. And yet, Marco's accounts were more than just fanciful tales. They were seeds planted in the fertile ground of curiosity, eventually blossoming into the age of exploration. Marco's legacy is a testament to the power of storytelling. His tales, regardless of their veracity, captured the imagination of a continent and paved the way for a new era of exploration and discovery. His story is a reminder that sometimes the line between fact and fiction isn't just blurred, it's downright invisible. Marco may not have been the infallible hero of his own story, but he was a catalyst, igniting a spark that would burn for centuries. As we wrap up this historical odyssey, it's worth reflecting on why Marco Polo's journey continues to captivate us. Perhaps it's the allure of the unknown, the thrill of discovery that resonates with the adventurer in all of us. Or maybe it's the realization that stories, even those laced with embellishments, have the power to transcend time and inspire generations. In the end, Marco Polo's journey was a grand adventure, a blend of myth and reality that reminds us of the complex tapestry of history. It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question what we know, and to embrace the endless possibilities that lie beyond the horizon. So, as you tuck into bed tonight, perhaps pondering your own adventures or the journeys yet to come, remember Marco Polo. Remember the young Venetian who dared to dream beyond his city's canals, who ventured into the unknown and returned with tales that would echo through the ages. Whether his stories were fact, fiction, or a bit of both, they remain a testament to the power of curiosity and the human spirit's unyielding desire to explore the unknown. And who knows, maybe one day your own adventures will inspire someone else to look beyond their own horizon and ask, what if? Your eyelids flutter open in the dim light, and you're suddenly a medieval peasant in the 14th century. Welcome to your new life in a quaint European village, where the morning air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, and, well, the less-than-fresh aroma of livestock. You're up with the dawn because, let's face it, a rooster is your alarm clock, and it doesn't have a snooze button. As you pull yourself from your straw mattress, yes, that's straw, not memory foam, you're greeted by the sounds of a bustling village. The clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the chatter of your neighbors, and the distant clang of the blacksmith hammering away at his anvil. It's a symphony of survival, set against the backdrop of post-plague Europe, where about a third of the population recently decided to exit the scene. Casual, right? Let's talk about your economic situation, which is as grim as a medieval winter. You're a peasant, meaning your life revolves around agriculture and a constant struggle against both nature and nobility. You might be tilling the fields of a lord who, when he looks at you, sees not a person, but a rent payment. Wages. You're pulling in around 1 to 2 pence a day, if you're lucky. That's about as much as a loaf of bread costs, which means diversifying your diet isn't exactly on the menu. But here, where the plague threw a curveball into medieval economics. With so many people gone, the labor supply plummeted, and wages actually started to creep up. Imagine that, supply and demand in action, long before economists could put it in a textbook. The price of labor increased, and suddenly you peasants had a little bargaining power. Not enough to book a holiday in the south of France, but hey, maybe you could afford a few extra eggs. As you head out to the fields, you pass by the manor house, where the lord of the manor resides. The contrast between your humble abode and his stone fortress is, let's say, striking. There's a great divide between rich and poor, a canyon filled with gold coins on one side and empty pockets on the other. And while the rich can afford to flee to country estates when the plague hits, you're stuck here, hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. Now let's tackle the myth of medieval hygiene, or lack thereof. Contrary to popular belief, you and your fellow villagers aren't entirely unfamiliar with the concept of cleanliness. Sure, you might not bathe daily, but communal bathhouses exist, and people do use them. That said, antiseptic hand gel is centuries away, so diseases spread like gossip at the local tavern. And this brings us to the plague, the unwelcome guest no one invited, but everyone talked about. You see, the plague didn't discriminate. It rolled through Europe like a steamroller, flattening social structures and economies alike. It found an all-you-can-eat buffet in densely packed villages with, let's be honest, questionable sanitation. Rats and fleas were the real MVPs here, carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium that caused all this chaos. As you walk past the market stalls, you can't help but notice the absence of some familiar faces. By mid-morning, you're knee-deep in mud, working the fields, sowing seeds for a harvest that, fingers crossed, won't be devastated by poor weather or the Lord's taxes. Your hands are calloused from toil, but you take pride in your work. After all, without your efforts, there'd be no bread to break at the communal table. And in a world where bread is basically currency, that's a big deal. As you toil, think about this. Despite the hardships, the plague did reset some of the social norms. With fewer people around, you found yourself with a bit more autonomy and, dare I say, respect. The Lord might not be your best friend, but he's more reliant on you than ever before. And that's a small victory in the grand scheme of things. By midday, you're hungry, and it's time to break for a meal. Bread, cheese, maybe a bit of pottage if you're lucky. Pottage, by the way, is a thick stew made from whatever vegetables you can scavenge. It's not exactly gourmet, but it's warm and filling. You gather with your fellow villagers, sharing stories and news. There's a sense of community here that's hard to find in the modern world, a shared bond forged in the fires of adversity and survival. As the sun starts its slow descent, you find yourself reflecting on this unique time in history. The world is changing, and you're caught in the middle of it. The plague has reshaped the landscape, not just physically, but socially and economically. You're living through a pivotal moment, one that will be studied and dissected by historians for centuries to come. As evening approaches, you make your way back to your humble home, tired but grateful for another day. The village is quieter now, the hustle and bustle of morning replaced by the soft murmur of evening prayers. You collapse onto your straw mattress, pulling the coarse blanket over your weary body. Tomorrow you'll rise again with the sun, ready to face whatever challenges this medieval world throws your way. And there you have it, a day in the life of a 14th century peasant navigating the turbulent waters of a plague-stricken Europe. It's a world vastly different from today, yet eerily familiar in its struggles and triumphs. So, rest easy, medieval traveler. You've earned it. As you drift off, dreaming of a world where you don't wake up with a rooster as your personal alarm, dawn breaks, and it's time for another day of medieval survival. Today, you're headed to the market, a place that's part business hub, part social network, and part germ exchange program. Markets in the 14th century are as lively as they are essential, and yours is no exception. It's where you trade a few eggs for that rare luxury, a little gossip. Now let's talk trade routes. In the 14th century, these are the veins and arteries of Europe, pumping goods, culture, and, unfortunately, the plague from one place to another. Picture the Silk Road, but with fewer silks and more sinister bacteria piggybacking on rats and fleas. This is the era when cities like Florence and Venice aren't just postcard-perfect destinations. They're bustling epicenters of commerce and infection. Florence, with its thriving textile industry, is like the medieval version of Wall Street, minus the suits and skyscrapers. Meanwhile, Venice is the gateway to the East, a city that practically invented the idea of a marketplace. But these cities aren't just trading cloth and spices. They're also unknowingly trading the plague. Ships from the East dock with goods that were luxuries yesterday, but are tomorrow's liabilities. Imagine buying a bag of pepper only to find out it comes with a side of pestilence. Your local market is a microcosm of these grand trade routes, a place where the first whispers of illness cause more panic than a sudden drop in cattle prices. Primary sources from the time describe how the first signs of the plague, swellings, fevers, and the oh-so-charming buboes, sent people scrambling. Run for the hills wasn't just a figure of speech, it was a survival strategy. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio wrote about how families abandoned each other at the first signs of illness, proving that self-preservation is not a modern invention. Speaking of survival, let's dive into the economics of this mess. With so many people dropping like flies, there's suddenly a shortage of labor. Remember those 1 to 2 pence wages? Well, now you've got some leverage. The fields won't plough themselves, and the lords are starting to sweat. They need you more than you need them, which is a refreshing change of pace. This power shift is like a medieval workers' revolution, minus the union dues and picket lines. Price inflation is the name of the game. The cost of goods skyrockets because there are fewer people to produce them. Supply and demand aren't just economic theories, they're your new reality. Bread, your staple diet, is now a hot commodity, and bartering becomes an art form. Eggs, cheese, a random chicken, everything has a price, and it's always rising. The economy is as unstable as a medieval bridge, liable to collapse at any moment. And then there are the cures. Oh, the cures. If you think modern medicine has its quirks, wait till you hear about medieval remedies. Picture this. A doctor in a beaked mask, because, obviously, birds are immune to the plague, suggesting you carry a bouquet of posies to ward off disease. Or how about bloodletting, a practice so popular it deserves its own reality show? Medieval medicine. When in doubt, let it out. These cures reveal more about our desperation than our medical knowledge, which, let's be honest, is still in its infancy. But don't be too quick to mock. In a world where the average life expectancy is around 35, you'd clutch at straws or posies, too. These remedies are the medieval equivalent of wearing garlic around your neck to ward off vampires, except here, the vampires are microscopic and very, very real. As you haggle at the market, it's clear that every transaction is a gamble. Will this loaf of bread nourish you or bring the plague into your home? The market is a theater of survival, where every purchase could be your last, and every rumor could spell your doom. Yet amid the chaos, there's a strange sense of camaraderie. You're all in this mess together, navigating a world that's changing faster than you can say, Yersinia pestis. So as the sun sets, and you head back home with your hard-won goods, remember this. You're living through one of history's most transformative periods. The plague is more than just a disease. It's a catalyst for change, shaking up society in ways no one could have foreseen. And while you're just a small player in this grand drama, your role is pivotal. Tomorrow, you'll rise again, ready to face whatever fresh chaos the 14th century has in store. As you lay your head down after another chaotic day at the medieval market, the dawn of a new day brings yet another chapter in the soap opera that is 14th century Europe. Today, you're headed to the town square, or perhaps the local church, where politics, religion, and the plague collide in a spectacle more dramatic than an episode of Game of Thrones. The church bell tolls, a sound as familiar as the rooster that gets you up in the morning. It's your medieval invitation to a gathering that's part communion, part community crisis meeting. In a world where TikTok trends are centuries away, the church is the epicenter of both spiritual solace and social gossip. At the heart of this gathering is the question of how to survive a plague that respects neither piety nor power. Here the church is a strange beast, both a beacon of hope and a hotbed of superstition. On the one hand, it's a sanctuary offering prayers and the faint hope of divine intervention. On the other, it's a place where fear and ignorance can brew like a bad batch of ale. This duality is evident in the church's response to the plague. While some clerics preach compassion and charity, others are busy selling indulgences, a get-out-of-purgatory-free card, now available for the low price of your eternal soul. But let's not get too cynical. Many priests and monks genuinely strive to help the suffering, even as they struggle to understand a disease that defies explanation. Take the case of Pope Clement VI, who in 1348 issued a papal bull declaring that the plague was not God's wrath against sin, a rare voice of reason in a sea of panic. He even went so far as to offer sanctuary to Jews who were being scapegoated as plague spreaders. That's right, folks. In a time when rational thought is as scarce as clean drinking water, Clement VI steps up and says, hey, maybe don't blame the people who are also suffering. But while some leaders take a stand against the rising tide of hysteria, others aren't so enlightened. Enter flagellants, the medieval equivalent of viral influencers, minus the Instagram filters. These guys march from town to town, whipping themselves into a frenzy, literally, believing that self-inflicted pain will appease a wrathful deity. Their dramatic processions draw crowds like a medieval rock concert, sans the merch table. Yet, for all their fervour, they spread more hysteria than healing, turning towns into stages for their grim performances. The chaos doesn't end with religious spectacle. In the swirling storm of superstition and fear, scapegoating becomes the unfortunate norm. Jews, lepers, and even the innocent elderly are targeted, blamed for a disease they couldn't possibly have caused. In Strasbourg, 1349, approximately 2,000 Jews are massacred, victims of a society desperate to find a tangible enemy in an invisible war. It's a grim reminder of how fear can turn communities against their own, rewriting the script of solidarity into one of suspicion and betrayal. Yet, amid the turmoil, there are those who attempt to impose some semblance of order. Enter public health measures, medieval style. Cities like Milan implement quarantine protocols, locking infected families in their homes, an early, albeit harsh, version of social distancing. Meanwhile, authorities in Venice establish one of the first known quarantine stations on the island of Lazaretto Vecchio. It's a case of trial and error public health, where the stakes couldn't be higher. But let's debunk a myth or two. Contrary to popular belief, not everyone in the Middle Ages thought the plague was purely a spiritual affliction. There were inklings of a more scientific approach, albeit rudimentary. Some scholars and physicians of the time began to theorize about miasma, or bad air, as a cause of disease. It's not exactly germ theory, but it's a step towards understanding that maybe, just maybe, the plague isn't the result of divine displeasure. As you stand in the square, listening to the latest proclamations and exchanging whispers with your neighbors, it's impossible to ignore the social upheaval all around you. The plague has dismantled traditional hierarchies, creating a power vacuum that some are eager to fill. Opportunists rise from the ashes of the old order, and the social ladder begins to wobble. The nobles, once untouchable, find themselves negotiating with commoners who now have newfound leverage. It's a topsy-turvy world where the only certainty is uncertainty itself. And so, as the gathering disperses and you make your way back home, you can't help but reflect on the turbulent times. The plague is more than a disease. It's a catalyst for change, a force that reshapes society in ways both profound and pitiful. The church, the state, and the individual are all players in this grand drama, each trying to navigate a landscape as treacherous as it is transformative. The day ends as it began, with the tolling of the church bell, a reminder that in the midst of chaos, life goes on. Tomorrow you'll rise again, ready to face whatever fresh challenges the world throws your way. Because in the 14th century, resilience isn't just a virtue, it's a necessity. So, rest well, medieval traveller. The next chapter of history is waiting, and you're right in the middle of it. As the bell tolls its final echo, you head out, pondering this roller coaster of a century that seems intent on keeping everyone on their medieval toes. But enough about local shenanigans. Let's zoom out and see how Europe as a whole is handling this pesky plague. Now, if you think a pandemic in the middle of the 100 Years' War sounds like a historical version of Murphy's Law, you're spot on. This century-long family feud between England and France was already a hot mess before the plague gate-crashed the party. Armies were decimated not by swords, but by the bubonic plague, which had a knack for not caring whether you were fighting for a crown or a crust of bread. England and France had to do the medieval equivalent of hitting the pause button on their fight, with major campaigns being postponed or outright cancelled. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was one of the last major engagements before the Black Death swept across Europe like a particularly lethal and uninvited guest. You'd think the plague would be a great equalizer, but it turns out that even in pandemics, some are more equal than others. In densely populated urban areas, the plague spread like gossip in a royal court, whereas rural regions, with their natural social distancing, otherwise known as living miles apart, fared slightly better. Cities like Paris and London were hit hard. Imagine being packed into narrow streets with little to no sanitation, and you get the picture. The population density meant the plague had all the room it needed to party. In contrast, rural areas saw fewer cases, but they had their own struggles. With fewer hands to till the fields, food shortages became a grim reality. Yet not all cities played the same losing hand. Milan, for instance, took drastic measures that would make any modern quarantine look like a mild suggestion. When the plague was detected, city officials did the unthinkable. They walled up families in their homes, infected or not. It sounds like a horror movie, but this extreme form of social distancing had a surprising effect. Milan's plague death toll was significantly lower than other urban centers. It's the medieval equivalent of that meme-worthy phrase. It ain't much, but it's honest work. Migration patterns shifted like sand in the wind. Fearing the plague, those who could afford it fled the cities for the countryside, inadvertently spreading the disease further. The rural-urban divide became a game of hot potato, with people trying to outrun a disease that didn't need a horse or carriage. This mass movement reshaped Europe's demographic map, with some areas experiencing a population boom while others were left ghostly empty. And let's chat about quarantine, the medieval attempt at crowd control. The word itself comes from the Venetian practice of keeping ships at bay for 40 giorni, or 40 days, to ensure they were plague-free. It's a practice that sounds almost modern, except for the part where it involved more desperation than data. Ships were stuck offshore, turning harbors into floating purgatories. In a world where the only thing longer than a quarantine was the church sermon, patience was not exactly the virtue du jour. Back on land, the concept of social distancing was less about science and more about survival. The wealthy could retreat to their countryside estates, effectively isolating themselves in luxury. Meanwhile, the less fortunate were stuck in overcrowded conditions, trying to dodge both disease and debt. It was a tale as old as time, or at least as old as the plague, of haves and have-nots, where the latter bore the brunt of both illness and economic hardship. Yet through all this chaos, a strange sort of resilience emerged. Communities adapted, albeit clumsily, to their new reality. In some regions, the labor shortages led to the rise of tenant farming and sharecropping, as landowners had no choice but to offer better terms to attract workers. It's a mix of desperation and necessity that paved the way for slow social change, setting the stage for future revolutions. And speaking of revolutions, let's not forget that the plague didn't just disrupt social structures. It also gave a nudge to the arts and sciences. With so much death, life's fleeting nature became a central theme in art, giving rise to the macabre yet mesmerizing dance macabre motif. Meanwhile, the medical community, such as it was, started to question old assumptions and consider new theories, inching ever so slightly toward more scientific approaches to understanding disease. But let's not kid ourselves. Superstition still ruled the day. From talismans to incantations, the medieval world was awash in magical thinking, even as it grappled with grim reality. The line between science and superstition was as blurry as a wet manuscript, with both coexisting in a chaotic dance. As you wander through this ever-shifting landscape, it's clear that the plague was both a destroyer and a catalyst. It obliterated old ways, but it also sowed the seeds for new ones. Europe was a continent in flux, as fluid as it was fragile, where every day felt like living in a history book that no one had written yet. So as you make your way back home under the twilight sky, you're left with a sense of awe and bewilderment. The plague, for all its horror, was a force of transformation, reshaping a continent and its people. And tomorrow, as dawn breaks once more, you'll wake up to face this strange new world, a world that's still reeling, still adapting, and still very much alive. Rest up, medieval traveller. There are more chapters waiting to be written, more stories left to unfold. The plague may have altered the course of history, but it's the resilience of people like you that will define its legacy. As you stretch out under the medieval stars, let's take a moment to zoom out and reflect on what this tumultuous period has left in its wake. The plague didn't just shake up your daily grind. It was the catalyst for a seismic shift that would eventually lead to the end of feudalism. Yes, that's right, the very system that has you tethered to a plot of land and a lord who treats you like a walking tax return is on its way out. This is where demographic change meets economic revolution, and it all starts with that pesky labor shortage. With about 1/3 of Europe's population down for the count, the surviving workforce suddenly found themselves in short supply and high demand. Imagine the medieval job market. Fewer workers meant higher wages and better working conditions, or at least the medieval version of such luxuries. This labor leverage started to chip away at the rigid structures of feudalism, where peasants like you were bound to the land and its lords. Now, with options and bargaining power, some could negotiate their freedom or switch allegiances like a 14th century free agent. What a time to be alive! But wait, there's more. This shift wasn't just about money. It was about power and class dynamics too. As serfs gained more autonomy, the nobility had to adjust their playbook. The social contract was being rewritten, and while it didn't happen overnight, feudalism didn't just collapse like a poorly built castle wall. It set the stage for the rise of a more market-driven economy. The seeds of capitalism were being sown in the fertile, albeit plague-ravaged, soil of Europe. Let's switch gears and talk about the cultural impact of the Black Death, which was as profound as it was grim. The art and literature of the time reflected a society obsessed with mortality. Enter the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, a motif that depicted skeletons leading the living to their inevitable doom. It was the medieval version of a blockbuster horror flick, complete with skeletons shaking their bony hips in a morbid conga line. This isn't just art imitating life. It's art giving life a cheeky slap in the face, a reminder that death doesn't discriminate. Peasants, nobles, clergy, all were equal partners in this macabre tango. But before you get all misty-eyed at the thought of skeletons with a sense of rhythm, let's debunk the idea that the Dance of Death was simply a quaint, romantic notion. It was rooted in fear and a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos. The real appeal lies in its universality, a stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer, no matter how many gold coins you had stashed under your straw mattress. Literature, too, took a darker turn. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, is a collection of tales told by a group of young people holed up in a villa outside Florence, trying to escape the horrors of the plague. It's a masterpiece of storytelling, capturing both the horror and absurdity of life during a pandemic. Think of it as a 14th century Netflix series, binge-worthy and a bit scandalous, with tales that range from the comedic to the tragic. The Black Death didn't just inspire art and literature, it sparked a new way of thinking. With so much death, people began questioning long-held beliefs and traditions. Skepticism seeped into the cracks of medieval society, challenging the authority of the church and the rigid social structures. It was the beginning of a new intellectual movement that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. The very foundations of medieval thought were being shaken, paving the way for a more human-centered approach to life and learning. So, as you lie there contemplating the cosmic joke that is human existence, consider this. The legacy of the plague is both haunting and hopeful. It tore apart lives and communities, yet it also planted the seeds for renewal and reinvention. The structures of power were questioned, art and literature took bold new directions, and the stage was set for a more dynamic and diverse society. Fast forward to today, and the echoes of this period still resonate. Our modern world, with its pandemics and social upheavals, isn't so different from the plague-ridden past. History has a wry sense of humor, doesn't it? Just when you think you've left the past behind, it finds a way to creep back into the conversation. But that's the beauty of it. History isn't just about dates and dead people. It's a living tapestry of human experience. So, next time you hear someone romanticizing the past with tales of chivalry and simple living, remind them of the grit and grime that came with it. The Black Death was no fairy tale, but it was a catalyst for change. And in that change, we find the lessons and legacies that continue to shape our world. As you drift off to sleep, let this be your final takeaway. The past is not a distant land. It's the foundation upon which we build our future. The Black Death, for all its horror, is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit. And while we may not dance with death as our medieval ancestors did, we continue to navigate life's uncertainties with the same blend of fear, humor, and hope. Rest easy, medieval traveler. Tomorrow is another day, and history continues to unfold. You open your eyes and find yourself in the heart of ancient Rome, where the air's a bit fresher than you'd expect from a city of over 1 million people without modern plumbing. But don't get too comfortable. There's a lot to unpack about the lives of women here. First things first, forget any notions of Roman women lounging around in togas all day, sipping wine. These women are busy, and their roles are a blend of domestic duty, social maneuvering, and for a select few, political intrigue. Let's start with the fundamentals, the family. The Romans took the family unit seriously. If you think modern family dynamics are complex, you've got nothing on the Romans. The paterfamilias, or male head of the family, had near absolute control over the household, including matters of life and death. This isn't just a grumpy dad with a penchant for dramatic gestures. This is legally sanctioned power. Women, on the other hand, were expected to keep the household running smoothly, which was no small feat in a world without washing machines or Amazon Prime. Now, let's talk legal rights. Roman women were citizens, but before you cheer for ancient equality, know this. Citizenship didn't come with voting rights or political office for women. Think of it as a club membership with limited perks. Women could own property, though, and they could inherit wealth, provided the men in their lives allowed it. In fact, certain legal loopholes let women manage their own finances, a necessity for some elite women whose husbands were off conquering distant lands or dabbling in political mischief. And speaking of elite women, here's where things get spicy. While they couldn't hold official power, many elite women wielded significant influence behind the scenes. We're talking about orchestrating political marriages, managing estates, and sometimes even pulling strings in the Roman Senate. Take Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, who was rumored to have her hands in all sorts of political pies. Was she the power behind the throne, or just a savvy operator in a man's world? History's still debating, but it's clear she wasn't just sitting at home knitting togas. But let's be real, only a small fraction of women enjoyed such influence. For most, life was about managing the household. This wasn't just about keeping the kids in line and the fire burning. It was a full-time gig with no weekends off. Running a Roman household meant overseeing slaves, managing finances, and occasionally dealing with the odd family drama. It was an exhausting job that required a mix of skills, from diplomacy to logistics, and yet it never earned the same respect as the men's public roles. Now, on to marriage. If you're picturing romantic strolls through the Forum, think again. Marriage, for Roman women, was more akin to a business contract than a love story. Dowries were the name of the game, a financial transaction that often dictated the terms of the union. A wealthy family might fork over tens of thousands of sestertii, think Roman dollars, to secure a suitable match. And the marriage contract, it wasn't just a piece of parchment. It detailed everything from property rights to obligations, with clauses that could rival a modern-day prenup. As the morning sun climbs higher, you're getting a sense of how these women navigated a world designed by and for men. Their status was a complex matrix of class, family, and financial clout. An elite woman might have the luxury of influence and a team of slaves to help manage her affairs, while a plebeian woman might work alongside her husband in his trade, her hands as calloused as his. Despite the constraints, Roman women found ways to assert themselves. They might not have been able to vote, but they could certainly sway opinions. Their letters, preserved on wax tablets, reveal sharp minds and witty repartees. Consider the words of Cornelia, mother of the Gracchus brothers, who famously referred to her sons as her jewels. She wasn't just boasting about their achievements. She was highlighting the power of maternal influence in shaping Rome's future leaders. And let's not forget the societal expectations. The ideal Roman woman was supposed to embody virtues like chastity, modesty, and fidelity. Sounds quaint until you realize these ideals were often wielded as tools for control. A woman's reputation was as fragile as an ancient amphora, easily shattered by rumors or scandal. Yet, some women managed to turn these expectations to their advantage, crafting personas that allowed them to thrive in a society not built for their success. By now, you've got a taste of the morning routine for Roman women, from the elite to the everyday. It's a world where marriage is a strategic alliance, the household is a mini-empire, and influence is wielded quietly but effectively. As the day progresses, you'll see how these women navigate the challenges and opportunities of their time, all while balancing the demands of family and society. So, stay tuned. The day is young, and there's plenty more Roman intrigue to explore. As the sun climbs higher and Rome bustles to life, let's dive into the economic whirlwind that Roman women navigated with the finesse of a tightrope walker in a toga. Now, if you've been lulled into thinking that the ancient Roman economy was a guy's game, you're in for a surprise. Roman women were far more than just passive bystanders in the bustling marketplace of the empire. They were the unsung heroines of commerce, weaving their presence into the economic tapestry with every thread and coin. Let's start with a staple of Roman life, textiles. Imagine a world without Zara or H&M to supply your wardrobe. For Roman women, textiles were more than just the latest fashion. They were big business. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and even ran their own workshops. These weren't just hobby projects, but full-fledged enterprises. The Valeria sisters, for instance, were renowned for their high-quality woolen goods, turning their workshop into a powerhouse of productivity. The economic impact was significant, and yet, like a hidden gem in the Forum, their contributions often went unnoticed by the history books. But it wasn't just about textiles. Roman women also managed shops, dealing in everything from spices to jewelry. Picture them standing behind counters, haggling with customers, and managing inventories without the aid of Excel spreadsheets. The marketplace was a cacophony of voices, a place where a savvy woman could thrive if she had the grit to endure the rough and tumble of daily trade. Take Eumatia, a wealthy businesswoman from Pompeii who wasn't content to sit on her laurels or her husband's wealth. She built a successful enterprise in the fuller's trade, which involved cleaning and bleaching cloth, a business as essential as it was unglamorous. Eumatia even funded the construction of a grand building in the Forum of Pompeii, cementing her status and influence. Talk about making your mark. She literally built her legacy into the city's architecture. Despite these accomplishments, Roman women in business faced an uphill battle. Their economic contributions were both essential and undervalued, like the unsung hero of a blockbuster movie. Legal limitations meant that women often had to operate under the guise of male guardianship. It's like having the talent for a solo act, but needing a band to get on stage. But, oh, how they found ways to bend the rules without breaking them. Some even used strategic marriages as business alliances, with dowries serving as startup capital for new ventures. Consider the case of Ulpia, a woman who turned her dowry into a thriving olive oil business. Her operations were so successful that her oil amphorae were discovered as far afield as Britain. That's some serious reach for a business run from under a patriarchal thumb. Ulpia's story highlights the duality of Roman women's roles, constrained by societal norms, yet daring enough to redefine them. And here's a juicy tidbit. Some women became moneylenders, a role that gave them the power to influence local economies. They didn't just loan money. They wielded influence, shaping the financial landscape like a maestro conducting a symphony. Sometimes these women faced backlash, accused of greed or manipulation, labels conveniently ignored when applied to their male counterparts. It's a classic case of double standards, with a side of irony. Inscriptions and graffiti, those ancient tweets and Facebook posts etched in stone, reveal the presence of women in the day-to-day economy. They may not have had LinkedIn profiles, but they certainly networked with vigor. These women were entrepreneurs in every sense, from balancing ledgers to building client bases. Yet their stories often go untold, overshadowed by the grand narratives of emperors and generals. But why did these economic contributions matter? Well, they kept the empire running, fueling growth and innovation. It's the kind of historical reality that gets glossed over in favor of tales of conquest and glory. Roman women's economic roles highlight a fundamental truth. Societies are often sustained by those who operate in the background, unseen but indispensable. As the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the cobbled streets, remember that the marketplace wasn't just a place of commerce. It was a platform for women to assert their agency. Their roles were complex, their contributions vital, and their stories deserve to be shouted from the rooftops, or at least shared in a podcast, our modern forum for storytelling. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the rich tapestry of women's lives in ancient Rome. We've barely scratched the surface of their ingenuity and resilience. There's plenty more intrigue to explore, from the social networks they built to the cultural legacies they left behind. So stick around, the best is yet to come. As the bustling afternoon morphs into a more contemplative evening, we pivot from the economic to the political stage, where Roman women, cloaked in societal restrictions, found their own ways to shine. You might think ancient politics was a strictly toga and sandals boys' club, but hold onto your laurel wreaths, because women like Livia Drusilla were playing a high-stakes game of political chess right under everyone's noses. Now, before you picture Livia as a puppet master pulling strings in the shadows, let's set the record straight. While she didn't have a seat in the Senate, this formidable First Lady of Rome was anything but a passive observer. Her influence came through her relationships, a social strategy as sophisticated as any modern-day political campaign. Livia was married to Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and her knack for political maneuvering was legendary. She was rumored to have been the real power behind the throne, advising Augustus on matters of state, and even allegedly orchestrating some strategic family reshuffles. Livia's reputation was such that her whisper could sway senatorial decisions, proving that influence doesn't always need a formal office. But let's not get carried away with the mythos. Livia wasn't some Machiavellian mastermind bent on world domination. Her methods were more subtle, more akin to a game of Roman diplomacy. She used her position to promote her sons, Tiberius and Drusus, positioning them as heirs to the imperial throne. The result, Tiberius wound up as emperor. Coincidence? Maybe. But in the intricate dance of Roman politics, Livia's steps were both calculated and graceful. Women like Livia wielded influence through social networks that were the Roman equivalent of power lunches or Senate retreats. Salons were the hub of intellectual and political discourse, where ideas were exchanged as freely as gossip. These gatherings, hosted by influential women, were breeding grounds for political alliances. Think of them as the ancient version of LinkedIn, minus the annoying connection requests. Women could subtly guide conversations, introduce their favored candidates, and even broker deals that would ripple through the political landscape. Marriage was another potent tool in the arsenal of Roman women. It was less about starry-eyed romance and more about power consolidation. Elite families arranged marriages with all the strategic precision of a military campaign, often setting up alliances that could influence the balance of power across Rome. Women like Julia, the daughter of Augustus, were key players in this matrimonial chessboard. Her marriages were political moves designed to bolster the emperor's alliances. It's a classic tale of marriage as diplomacy, where love took a back seat to legacy. But it wasn't just political maneuvering that gave Roman women their influence. They were patrons of the arts, using their wealth and status to support poets, playwrights, and artists. Such patronage wasn't just about cultural enrichment. It was a statement of power and taste. Women like the poet Sulpicia used their literary talents to shape cultural narratives, slipping in subtle commentaries on the society around them. Her works, though few survive, offer a tantalizing glimpse into the intellectual life of Roman women. Let's talk numbers, because dollars, or rather denarii, talk. The financial clout of these women was no small potatoes. They could fund public buildings, sponsor games, or commission works of art, leaving a legacy as enduring as any emperor's. The money they controlled was a testament to their influence, a tangible expression of power in a society obsessed with wealth and status. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a high-stakes episode of Game of Thrones, you're not far off. The allure of Roman women as passive figures is a myth ripe for debunking. Their subtle yet significant influence was woven through the corridors of power, challenging the notion that they were mere footnotes in the annals of history. The reality: these women were the silent architects of their era, crafting legacies that would outlast the crumbling ruins of Rome. Yet, despite their influence, the risk of scandal always loomed. A woman who overstepped societal bounds could be cast as manipulative or dangerous, a narrative conveniently ignored when men played the same game. It's the kind of double standard that would make any modern feminist cringe. The infamous case of Claudia Mitelli, accused of everything from poisoning to promiscuity, illustrates how a woman's reputation could be weaponized against her. But even in the face of scandal, many women held their ground, their resilience a testament to their strength. In the grand tapestry of Roman history, women's roles were as complex as the political machinations they navigated. They operated in a world that didn't officially recognize their power, yet they left indelible marks on the empire's cultural and political landscape. As we move forward, remember that these stories are far from complete. The next chapters will delve deeper into how these women continue to shape their world, one calculated move at a time. So, keep your tunics on. There's more to unravel as we explore the intricate lives of Roman women. Their stories are a reminder that influence often thrives in the margins, where the whispers of history echo louder than any decree. Stay tuned as we delve further into the legacy of these remarkable women, whose deft maneuvering and cultural patronage left a legacy that reverberates through the ages. And speaking of maneuvering, let's take a detour from the political chessboard to the Roman baths, where the real wheeling and dealing of daily life happened. Forget any notions of spa-like serenity or exclusive retreats. These were lively, all-access arenas where society's layers mixed like a Roman salad, topped with a drizzle of social networking. Now, before we get too deep, let's address the elephant, or perhaps the elephantine misconception, in the room. The romanticized vision of Roman baths as decadent havens of pleasure. Yes, they were luxurious compared to, say, a medieval peasant's life, but they were also incredibly functional. More YMCA than five-star resort, they had something for everyone. Relaxation, exercise, and most importantly, gossip. Picture this. It's the afternoon, and you're heading to the Thermae, the grand public baths. These weren't just any old bathhouses. They were sprawling complexes, some covering over 32,000 square meters. The baths of Caracalla, for example, were an architectural marvel, boasting mosaic floors, towering columns, and enough room to host a small army, or at least a sizable portion of Rome's populace. Women, just like men, had their designated times and sections. But let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't an egalitarian paradise. Women typically bathed in the mornings, a less crowded time, and had fewer facilities than their male counterparts. Still, the bathhouse was a microcosm of Roman life, where social hierarchies mingled and sometimes blurred. These baths weren't just about hygiene, they were about networking. For Roman women, this was a place to exchange news, seal deals, and forge alliances. It was LinkedIn in a toga, with steam rooms instead of break rooms. This was where you could catch up on the latest political intrigue or hear which merchant was selling the finest silks. The conversations were as varied as the patrons, from the mundane to the monumental. The social scene at the baths was as diverse as a Roman street market. You might find Eumatia, the businesswoman from Pompeii we mentioned earlier, chatting with a client about a new shipment of wool. Or perhaps you'd hear a group of matrons discussing the latest exploits of a general on the front lines. It was a cacophony of voices, a daily symphony of social and economic interaction. But let's not get too glamorized. The baths were also a place of practical necessity. With no running water at home for most, this was how Romans kept clean. And cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to health. The Romans understood the connection between bathing and well-being, even if their medical theories were a bit off the mark. Think of it as ancient preventive medicine, bundled with a side of community engagement. And speaking of engagement, let's talk about the myth of the scandalous bathhouse. Sure, lurid tales of debauchery make for great storytelling, but the reality was more pedestrian. Most Romans were there to scrub off the daily grime, not to engage in bacchanalian revelry. The baths were a public space, and public decorum was expected. That said, the occasional scandal did occur. After all, human nature hasn't changed much in 2 millennia. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Economically, the baths were a testament to Roman engineering and social welfare. Entry was either free or cost a nominal fee, around a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, making them accessible to virtually everyone. This was social infrastructure at its finest, a government-subsidized service that kept the populace clean and, perhaps more importantly, content. Archaeological evidence gives us a peek into these daily routines. Excavations reveal the layout of the baths, with their caldariums, hot rooms, tepidariums, warm rooms, and frigidariums, cold rooms. The Romans knew how to layer their bathing experience like a good tiramisu, start hot, move to warm, and finish with a refreshing chill. Inscriptions and graffiti left behind tell tales of daily life, snippets of conversations forever etched in stone. The baths were also a place for exercise and education. Gymnasiums and libraries were often part of the complex, making the bathhouse a one-stop shop for physical and mental stimulation. Imagine lifting weights before hitting the hot tub, then cooling off with a good scroll in the library. It was a holistic approach to wellness that any modern fitness guru could envy. But let's not forget the dark side of this Roman institution. The baths were a breeding ground for disease, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by contemporary critics. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, once complained about the noise and the risk of infection, lamenting that the baths were as much a health hazard as a health boon. It's a reminder that even the grandest innovations have their flaws. As the afternoon sun dipped low, the baths emptied, leaving behind echoes of the day's chatter. They weren't just places of leisure. They were vital nodes in the network of Roman society, where women found space to maneuver, negotiate, and refresh themselves in a world that often sought to constrain them. So the next time you hear about Roman baths, think beyond the steamy allure. Remember the real stories of connection, commerce, and community that played out in these ancient hubs of activity. The bathhouse was a stage where everyday life unfolded, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of Roman women, who navigated its waters with the same skill they applied to the rest of their complex lives. As we leave the baths behind and venture into the evening, keep in mind that the day is far from over. There's more to explore in the rich tapestry of Roman society, from the cultural legacies these women left to the personal battles they fought. Stay with us as we continue this journey through time, uncovering the stories that shaped an empire and the women who refused to be mere footnotes in its history. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting its final glow over the 7 hills of Rome, it's time to reflect on the legacy of Roman women. Their stories are like the city's cobbled streets, winding, complex, and full of hidden surprises. These women were the backbone of Roman society, despite being often sidelined in the grand narratives of emperors and gladiators. It's high time we shine a light on their contributions and see how they continue to challenge our perceptions of gender roles in both history and the present day. Let's kick things off with the family unit, the cornerstone of Roman life, where women played pivotal roles. While the paterfamilias strutted around with legal authority, the real spine of the household was often the materfamilias. Women like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, were the architects of their children's futures. She famously referred to her sons as her jewels, and her influence was no mere hyperbole. She molded them into reformers who would leave a lasting impact on Rome's social landscape. Cornelia's story is a testament to the power of maternal influence, a reminder that the hand that rocks the cradle often steers the state. Economically, Roman women were more than just domestic goddesses. Their business acumen was as sharp as any senator's tongue. Whether they were running textile workshops or managing estates, women like the Valeria sisters and Eumatia showed that you didn't need to wear a toga to have a head for numbers. Eumatia, bless her entrepreneurial heart, even funded a public building in Pompeii, ensuring her name would be etched in history long after the ash settled. These women were the silent investors in Rome's bustling economy, their contributions as essential as they were overlooked. But let's not pretend it was all business and no pleasure. Roman women were also patrons of culture, using their influence to foster the arts. Take Sulpicia, the poet who navigated the intricacies of love and society with a quill as her weapon of choice. Her surviving works, though scarce, offer a rare glimpse into the inner lives of women who dared to speak their truth. Roman women didn't just consume culture, they actively shaped it, leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages. Politically, the narrative is equally compelling. Women like Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus, were masters of the art of influence. Though barred from holding office, they found ways to sway decisions and shape policy through family connections and social networks. Livia's deft maneuvering ensured her son Tiberius ascended to the throne, a feat of political engineering that would make any modern strategist envious. It's a potent reminder that power isn't just about title. It's about presence, strategy, and sometimes a well-placed whisper. Now let's bust a few myths. The romanticized notion of the passive Roman woman is as misleading as a politician's promise. These women were anything but passive. They navigated a society that often sought to silence them, finding ways to assert their agency in a world designed by and for men. Whether through economic enterprise, cultural patronage, or political influence, they carved out spaces for themselves, challenging the restrictive norms of their time. The reality, however, wasn't without its harshness. For every Cornelia or Livia, there were countless women whose names history has forgotten, their contributions lost in the sands of time. Yet, even in the face of societal constraints, Roman women found ways to adapt and thrive. Their resilience is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that influence often lies in the margins, where the whispers of history echo louder than any decree. So, what can we learn from these ancient narratives today? For starters, they remind us that gender roles are neither fixed nor universal. The stories of Roman women challenge our perceptions, showing us that women have always found ways to influence their world, even when the odds were stacked against them. In a world still grappling with questions of gender equality, these tales hold valuable lessons about power, agency, and resilience. In the grand tapestry of history, the legacy of Roman women is a vibrant thread, weaving through the ages with a message that's as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. They remind us that history isn't just about the victories of great men, but also about the everyday triumphs of those who dared to defy the status quo. As we continue to explore these stories, let's remember to look beyond the myths and romanticized narratives, embracing the complexity and nuance that make history truly compelling. And as you drift off to sleep, let the stories of these remarkable women linger in your thoughts. They are a testament to the power of influence, a reminder that even in a world that sought to confine them, Roman women found ways to leave an indelible mark on history. Their legacy continues to inspire, challenging us to question, to learn, and to celebrate the myriad ways in which women have shaped, and continue to shape, the world. The smell of smoke and the clang of metal greet you at the break of dawn. Forget the gentle chime of an alarm clock. In your medieval world, it's the insistent crow of a rooster or maybe a loud thud from a neighbor's cart that drags you from slumber. As a blacksmith, your day kicks off before the sun has even considered hitting the snooze button. You've got a fire to tend, and it's not the kind you can set and forget like a modern-day crockpot. Nope, this beast demands constant feeding with charcoal and bellows, and it'll eat up your morning faster than a medieval monk downs his ale. Let's talk tools. Today, you'll be wielding some medieval multitaskers. The hammer, anvil, tongs, and file. These aren't just tools, they're extensions of your very soul, or at least they better be if you want to keep all your fingers intact. The hammer isn't some dainty 16-ounce claw. You're swinging a 3-5-pounder, and trust me, you'll feel every ounce by the end of the day. The anvil, a solid chunk of iron weighing in at 100 to 200 pounds, is the center of your universe, offering a surface as steadfast as your own resolve. And when you need to hold that red-hot iron, you'll thank the heavens for your trusty tongs, unless you fancy a medieval barbecue featuring your own hands. Now, let's get into the economics of your trade because, surprise, blacksmithing is not just about brawn. It's a numbers game. Iron doesn't grow on trees or in the ground, technically, with a pound costing you around 1 penny, roughly 2 days' wages for a laborer. Charcoal, your fuel of choice, isn't free either. It's about the same price, turning your forge into a literal money pit. You've got to be as shrewd as a merchant and as tough as your wares, because every horseshoe and nail you craft needs to justify its cost. You're not just pounding metal, you're pounding out a living. Let's smash that romantic image of the solitary blacksmith, hammering away in idyllic isolation with only the gentle hum of nature as his soundtrack. Romantic, sure, but about as real as a dragon sighting at the local tavern. Your workshop is bustling, alive with apprentices bumbling about, trying not to burn the place down. There's a constant din from the tools, the roar of the forge, and the chatter of customers, all demanding your attention at once. Solitary, more like a medieval mosh pit, with you conducting the chaos. In medieval society, you're not just any artisan. You're the linchpin holding it all together. The armor that knights don for jousts and battles. That's your handiwork. The horseshoes that keep steeds galloping across kingdoms and back. Yep, you're the hero behind those two. Your metalworks are essential, from the humble nail to the grandiose gates of a lord's manor. Without you, a castle would be about as defensible as a sandcastle at high tide. So, while you might think of yourself as just another cog in the medieval machine, remember that you've got the power to shape society, literally. You're the metal maestro, the one who turns raw materials into marvels. And tomorrow it all starts again with that rooster's crow, your forge's roar, and the endless dance of hammer and anvil. And just like that, you're back at it, hammer in hand, ready to tackle the day's challenges. First up, horseshoes. Sounds simple, right? Like the medieval version of flipping burgers at a fast food joint. But let's not underestimate the complexity of bending iron into the perfect U-shape. It's more than just whacking metal until it looks vaguely horseshoeish. You're balancing strength with flexibility, ensuring that every shoe fits its hoof like a medieval glass slipper, without the fairy godmother, of course. Your technique isn't just about brute force, it's a dance of precision and timing. Heat the iron too long, and it's as pliable as a politician's promises. Too cold, and you might as well be hammering a rock. You've got to strike while the iron is hot, literally. And that's where your trusty bellows come in, breathing life into the fire like a dragon with a caffeine addiction. One misstep, and you're not just wasting precious materials. You're risking the wrath of your equestrian clientele, who are less forgiving than that dragon. Then there's the artistry of weapon crafting. Now, if you're thinking this means endless racks of swords glistening in the sun, hold your horses. Yes, swords are part of the repertoire, but so are axes, spears, and those ever-popular arrowheads. Each piece demands its unique blend of strength and sharpness, like crafting the perfect tweet, where form, function, and a touch of flair meet. And let's not forget, you're doing all this in a setting that's less about ergonomic workspaces and more about dodging molten metal and smoke thicker than a medieval mystery. Speaking of smoke, let's chat about the occupational hazards. Ever wondered why blacksmiths have that rugged, slightly roasted look? It's not just for aesthetics. Burns, cuts, and bruises are a given, like taxes and bad weather. But the real kicker is the respiratory issues. You're essentially marinating your lungs with smoke and metal particles every day. The medieval blacksmith's life expectancy, not exactly golden years material. They often didn't live to see the back nine, or even the front nine of what we'd call retirement age. But fear not, young apprentice, because you're not diving into this molten madness alone. The path to becoming a master smith is a rigorous one, often starting in your early teens. You're the medieval equivalent of an unpaid intern, minus the coffee runs. For about 7 years, you'll be learning the ropes, or rather, the hammers. You'll start with the basics, learning to swing a hammer without hitting yourself, and gradually work your way up to more complex tasks, like crafting those intricate weapon designs. This apprenticeship system isn't just about skill building. It's a rite of passage. You're not just learning how to shape metal, but how to navigate the forge's social hierarchy. You've got to earn your stripes, literally, as in the calluses on your hands. And while it might seem like a raw deal, remember, this was your ticket to a stable job in a world where job security was as mythical as a unicorn. By the end of your apprenticeship, you're not just a tradesman. You're a certified metal magician, ready to take on the world, or at least its horses and knights. And let's not romanticize the idea of a lone blacksmith working in serene solitude. It's not a one-man show. Your workshop is a bustling hub, with apprentices like yourself, journeymen who have completed their training and are honing their craft, and of course, the master smith overseeing it all. It's more like an artisanal assembly line, with everyone playing their part to keep the fires burning and the anvils ringing. This isn't just hard labor, it's a community effort, a medieval team-building exercise with a side of molten metal. You're part of a long tradition, a fraternity of fire and iron, where every clang of the hammer is a note in the symphony of craftsmanship. And while the work is grueling, there's a certain satisfaction in seeing a sword or a horseshoe take shape, knowing that you've transformed raw metal into something functional and, dare I say, beautiful. So, as the day winds down and the forge's fire dims, take a moment to appreciate the art and science of your trade. You're not just shaping metal, you're shaping history, one hammer strike at a time. And tomorrow, when that rooster crows and you step back into the forge, remember, you're not just forging tools and weapons, you're forging a legacy. As the day winds down and the forge's fire dims, the chatter in your bustling workshop slowly fades, leaving behind the rhythmic clink of tools being put away. You, the blacksmith, stand at the heart of the community's web, not just crafting metal, but forging the very backbone of medieval life. Let's dive into this role, shall we? Forget the image of the jolly blacksmith with a permanent grin plastered on his soot-stained face. The reality is far more complex and, dare I say, intriguing. In your medieval village or town, the social hierarchy is as rigid as the iron you work with. At the top, you've got your lords and ladies, swanning about in their manners, blissfully unaware or uncaring of the gritty realities of peasant life. Beneath them, the clergy holds spiritual sway, and then come the merchants and skilled tradesmen like yourself. You're not exactly rubbing elbows with royalty, but you're also not knee-deep in the muck like the serfs. You're the middle class of the medieval world, a rare and vital breed, with one foot in the artisanal realm and the other in the economic engine of your community. But don't get too comfortable. Economic stability in the Middle Ages is about as reliable as a medieval map. Prices for your raw materials, like iron and charcoal, fluctuate with the political winds. A skirmish between local lords or a bad harvest can send costs soaring faster than a night on a sugar high. In the 14th century, a pound of iron might cost a penny today, but tomorrow, who knows? It could be 2. That's the equivalent of trying to budget for groceries when the price of bread doubles overnight. Your livelihood is a constant juggle between supply, demand, and sheer luck. And let's talk about your clientele. You're not just making horseshoes and plowshares for the local farmer, oh no. You're also the go-to for the gentry's more extravagant requests. Need a new suit of armor for the upcoming tournament, Sir Fancy Pants? You're the guy. The local knight's life may depend on your craftsmanship when he's charging into battle, and that's not a responsibility you take lightly. Each piece you create must withstand the chaos of combat, which is no small feat when metallurgy is more alchemy than science. Your craftsmanship is literally a matter of life and death, a medieval version of being a life coach, but with a lot more hammering involved. But here's the kicker: you're also a sort of medieval therapist. Folks from all walks of life come to your forge, not just for your wares, but for a chat. Your workshop is the local hub, the place where news is exchanged faster than you can say pigeon post. You're privy to tales of romance, gossip about who's courting whom, and whispers of rebellion. You're like the village's unofficial counselor with a side of blacksmithing. And let's be honest, who wouldn't spill their secrets to someone wielding a hammer? Still, the myth of the jolly blacksmith persists. It's a romantic notion that paints you as a cheerful giant, tirelessly working with a song on your lips and a twinkle in your eye. Reality check. You're more likely grumbling over the latest tax hike imposed by the local lord, or nursing a blister from a particularly stubborn piece of iron. Your economic reality is a tightrope walk, balancing the cost of materials with the prices you can charge, all while keeping your apprentices from accidentally setting themselves on fire. Political events are the wild cards in your deck. A war or an alliance can change everything overnight. Suddenly, you're not just a blacksmith, you're a defense contractor. The demand for weapons skyrockets, and your forge becomes a war room, churning out swords and spears as if the fate of the kingdom rests on your anvil. And in a way, it does. But once the dust settles and peace returns, you're back to making hinges and hoes. It's a volatile existence where your economic fortunes rise and fall with every skirmish and treaty. Yet, even with these challenges, there's a certain satisfaction in your work. You're not just a cog in the medieval machine, you're the engine that helps keep it running. Every horseshoe you craft, every plowshare you shape, every sword you fashion, it all contributes to the greater good of your community. You're the unsung hero, the artisan behind the scenes, crafting not just metal, but the very fabric of medieval life. So, as you extinguish the day's last embers and step back from the forge, take a moment to appreciate your place in this world. You're not just a blacksmith, you're a cornerstone of your community, a craftsman whose work touches every aspect of daily life. And while the myth of the jolly blacksmith may not be entirely accurate, there's no denying the essential, if sometimes gritty, role you play in the grand tapestry of history. Tomorrow, you'll pick up your hammer once more, ready to shape the day's challenges into something more than mere metal. And as the day's last embers flicker out, you find yourself thinking about how blacksmithing has evolved over the centuries, like a metal-loving chameleon adapting to its industrial jungle. It wasn't all brute force and sweat. Ingenious minds were constantly dreaming up ways to make your life a little easier, or at least less of a medieval workout. Enter the water-powered trip hammer, the medieval equivalent of hiring an extra pair of hands, minus the attitude and lunch breaks. Now I know what you're thinking. Water-powered what now? Picture a giant hammer, too hefty for even the most brawny blacksmith to wield solo, driven by the gentle, relentless flow of a river. This beast of a machine didn't just swing with the force of 1,000 hammers. It swung with the precision and consistency that only a machine could muster. By the 12th century, these marvels of medieval engineering were pounding away in Europe, turning what was once a Herculean task into something almost manageable. Let's talk specifics, because numbers are the secret source of history. A single trip hammer could handle the workload of several smiths, reducing the time and muscle needed to refine iron. This was a game-changer, especially when your biceps were starting to resemble overworked sausages. The result? More iron, more quickly, and with less sweat dripping into your shoes. And in a world where time is money, or at least a few extra pennies for a pint, this was revolutionary. The economic impact was like tossing a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples spread. With trip hammers in play, iron production soared, and suddenly the stuff was a bit more accessible. This wasn't just good news for blacksmiths. It was a boon for everyone from knights to peasants. More iron meant more tools, more weapons, and more infrastructure, which meant more progress. It was like the medieval version of upgrading from dial-up to fiber optic, game-changing, to say the least. However, with great power, and by power, I mean the relentless pounding of a water-driven hammer, came great responsibility. The increased supply of iron and the ability to produce goods more rapidly nudged prices down. While this sounds like a win for the medieval consumer, it squeezed the margins for blacksmiths like you. Suddenly, your finely crafted horseshoes had to compete with the mass-produced variety. It was the dawn of an economic environment where efficiency started to edge out artisanal quality, a theme that feels as modern as it is medieval. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. The introduction of such technology didn't exactly make every blacksmith jump for joy. For some, it was like trading in their trusty steed for a mechanical monstrosity. The romance of the forge, the intimate dance between man and metal, was now sharing the stage with cold, unfeeling machinery. Sure, it made the job easier, but it also stripped a bit of the soul from the craft. The myth of the lone blacksmith, hammer in hand, shaping his destiny with each swing, was starting to crack under the weight of progress. But wait, there's more. The technological revolution didn't stop at the trip hammer. As the medieval period waned, society began to experience a tectonic shift. The Renaissance was dawning, and with it came a tidal wave of new ideas and inventions. Metallurgy, that magical mix of science and alchemy, was evolving rapidly. Techniques improved, and the introduction of the blast furnace in the 15th century cranked iron production up to 11. It was like going from a cozy campfire to a roaring bonfire, a whole new level of heat and efficiency. The blast furnace wasn't just a bigger, badder version of your forge. It was a towering inferno that could reach temperatures undreamed of in earlier times, allowing for the mass production of iron. And when I say mass, I mean the kind of mass that makes you wonder if someone is compensating for something. This meant cheaper iron and more of it, fueling everything from the construction of sprawling cathedrals to the arming of entire armies. The age of iron, indeed. But here's the kicker. This technological leapfrogging wasn't just about making more stuff. It was about changing the very fabric of society. The rise of the blast furnace and the burgeoning iron industry contributed to the decline of the traditional, small-scale blacksmith. The quaint village smithy was gradually overshadowed by larger, more centralized ironworks. It was the dawn of industrialization, creeping in like a slow, inevitable tide. You might be thinking, well, that sounds a bit grim for our blacksmith friend, and you're not wrong. The shift from artisanal craftsmanship to industrial production was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it opened up new opportunities and drove down costs, making metal goods more accessible than ever. On the other hand, it marginalized the role of the individual blacksmith, who was once the linchpin of his community. As society shifted gears, the blacksmith found himself at a crossroads. The demand for traditional blacksmithing dwindled as the Renaissance ushered in new professions and trades. The role of the blacksmith was evolving, no longer just a craftsman, but a cog in a much larger machine. The world was getting bigger, faster, and more connected. The once isolated village forge was now part of a vast, interlinked network that spanned continents. But here's the silver lining in this medieval cloud. Innovation breeds adaptation. The most resourceful blacksmiths didn't just survive this shift, they thrived. They diversified, specializing in bespoke items and luxury goods that mass production couldn't replicate. They became the go-to artisans for high-quality, custom metalwork that required a personal touch and a skilled hand. In many ways, they were the original hipsters, bringing back artisanal craftsmanship before it was cool. As the medieval world morphed into the early modern era, the blacksmith's tale wasn't one of obsolescence, but of reinvention. The water-powered trip hammer and the blast furnace were just chapters in a longer story, one of resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity. So, the next time you hear the clang of metal or see a gleaming piece of ironwork, remember the legacy of the blacksmith. the unsung hero of history who hammered out not just tools and weapons, but the very foundation of society itself. And while the myth of the jolly blacksmith working blissfully in his forge might be more fiction than fact, there's no denying that behind every hammer strike was a craftsman who shaped not just metal, but the world around him. As we edge closer to the modern age, where machines and technology continue to redefine our lives, let's not forget the lessons of the past, that innovation is a double-edged sword, and that true craftsmanship never goes out of style. And so, here we are, staring down the barrel of history, where the medieval blacksmith's legacy looms large like a shadow cast by a blazing forge. It's a legacy that has hammered itself into the annals of time, despite, or perhaps because of, the industrial revolutions, technological upheavals, and cultural shifts that have since reshaped humanity. You see, the blacksmith isn't just a relic of the past. He's the forefather of modern craftsmanship and engineering, the ancestor of today's industrial titans. Strip away the soot and sweat, and you'll find the blueprint for innovation itself, one hammer strike at a time. Let's tackle a few myths that modern media loves to peddle about our soot-smeared heroes. First, the image of the blacksmith as a solitary hermit, pounding away in blissful solitude, oblivious to the world. Romantic, yes, but about as realistic as a unicorn at a jousting tournament. In reality, blacksmiths were as much a part of the community as the village pub. Their forges were lively hubs of activity, where apprentices scurried, journeymen honed their skills, and locals gathered to share news and gossip. It was less lonely craftsmen, and more social butterfly with an anvil. And then there's the notion that blacksmiths were always gloriously muscled, biceps bulging like overripe fruit, thanks to the constant hammering. While there's no denying the physicality of the job, the truth is that blacksmiths came in all shapes and sizes. Sure, swinging a 5-pound hammer isn't for the faint-hearted, but it's technique as much as muscle that gets the job done. Think less Hercules, more master of physics and leverage. After all, they say the pen is mightier than the sword, but in this case, the hammer was mightier than both. Now, what about the enduring myth of the blacksmith as a master of weapons, crafting blade after exquisite blade for every knight in shining armor? While weaponry was certainly part of the repertoire, it was horseshoes, nails, and everyday tools that paid the bills. Your average blacksmith was more likely to be found shaping a plough than a sword, a fact that's about as glamorous as a Monday morning traffic jam. But let's face it, without those ploughs, swords wouldn't have much food to steal. Yet, the romantic allure of the blacksmith persists, and for good reason. There's something undeniably captivating about fire and metal, about the transformation of raw materials into objects of utility and beauty. It taps into a primal part of us, a reminder that at the heart of progress is the fire of creativity and the anvil of determination. It's the kind of stuff that makes for great stories, even if the truth is a bit more mundane. Speaking of truth, let's talk legacy. The techniques and tools honed by medieval blacksmiths didn't just vanish with the rise of industrialization. They evolved. Modern blacksmithing may not look exactly like it did in the Middle Ages, but the roots are unmistakably there. Today's artisans still use hammers and anvils, though perhaps with a bit more finesse and less risk of third-degree burns. The tradition of apprenticeship lives on, with master blacksmiths passing down their knowledge to eager novices, ensuring the craft remains as dynamic as ever. Moreover, the principles that guided medieval blacksmiths, precision, patience, and innovation, are the same ones driving modern engineering and manufacturing. The blacksmith's ethos of craftsmanship over convenience, of quality over quantity, is a timeless lesson in a world increasingly obsessed with speed and efficiency. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way forward is to look back, to embrace the wisdom of those who came before us. And let's not forget the cultural impact. The blacksmith has been immortalized in literature, film, and folklore, a symbol of resilience, strength, and ingenuity. From Hephaestus and Vulcan to modern-day superheroes wielding hammers, the archetype endures. It's a testament to the power of myth, to the way stories shape our understanding of history and ourselves. Even if the reality was more soot and sweat than magic and might, the essence remains. The idea that with hard work and a bit of fire, anything is possible. So, as we close this chapter on the medieval blacksmith, let's leave with a healthy dose of appreciation for those who shaped the world with iron and fire. They were the unsung architects of progress, the artisans who laid the foundation for everything from skyscrapers to space shuttles. And while their world may have been one of grit and grime, their legacy is one of enduring brilliance. In the end, the blacksmith's tale is a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt and innovate. It's a reminder that even in the face of change, the core values of craftsmanship and creativity remain constant. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps the rhythmic clang of a hammer will echo in your dreams, a lullaby from a time when fire and iron shaped not just metal, but the very course of history. In the bustling little town of Salzburg, where the hills are alive with the sound of music, and probably a few disgruntled neighbors, something extraordinary was happening in 1756. Enter Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a pint-sized prodigy who could rival any modern child star for sheer audacity and talent. Picture a 5-year-old who composed his first piece of music before most kids can even tie their shoelaces. That's right. By the time most toddlers were mastering the fine art of not falling over their own feet, Mozart was already crafting minuets in G major like it was his second language. Mozart was born into a family that could be described as the 18th century version of a musical dynasty. His father, Leopold, wasn't your typical supportive dad cheering from the sidelines. Oh no, Leopold was more like the original stage dad, predating the likes of Joe Jackson and Kris Jenner by a couple of centuries. He was a composer and musician himself, but when it became clear that little Wolfgang had more talent in his pinky finger than most adults had in their entire bodies, Leopold shifted his focus entirely to his son's burgeoning career. Leopold recognized Wolfgang's genius early on, and realized that keeping this musical wunderkind hidden away in Salzburg would be like keeping a Stradivarius in a shoebox. So, what do you do when you have a prodigy on your hands? You take the show on the road, of course. By the time Wolfgang was 6, the Mozart family had packed their bags and set off on the 1700s version of a European tour. Forget tour buses and roadies. They were traveling by horse-drawn carriage, bouncing along uneven roads for miles, all in the name of showcasing Wolfgang's talents to the courts and concert halls of Europe. Now, here's where things get really intriguing. Little Wolfgang was not just a musical genius, he was also quite the character. During a performance for Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna, young Wolfgang did something that would make any modern PR agent break out in a cold sweat. After finishing his performance, he decided that sitting quietly like a good little boy was just too dull. So, in a scene straight out of a sitcom, he jumped up onto the Empress's lap. Now, you might think this would land him in hot water, but the Empress, charmed by his audacity, simply laughed it off. Talk about having the right friends in high places. But let's not get too carried away by the romantic notion of a prodigal child charming European courts with his cherubic smile and nimble fingers. The reality was a little more nuanced and exhausting. These tours were grueling. We're talking thousands of miles over the course of years, schlepping from city to city, performing night after night. And remember, this was the age before comfy travel pillows and in-flight entertainment. There was nothing cushy about it, and yet young Wolfgang thrived in this environment, soaking up influences from every city, every composer, and every musical tradition he encountered. It's easy to romanticize Mozart's childhood as one long series of curtain calls and standing ovations, but the truth is, this was a high-stakes game orchestrated by Leopold. He was a man on a mission, determined to capitalize on his son's gifts, and in many ways he succeeded. Under Leopold's watchful eye, Mozart became a sensation, proving that sometimes a little bit of parental pressure can turn coal into a diamond. So, while the world likes to remember Mozart as the starry-eyed genius who could do no wrong, it's important to remember the reality behind the legend. A child with exceptional talent, a father with an unyielding drive, and a life that was as much about the hustle as it was about the harmony. And thus began the story of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the boy wonder who would go on to change the face of music forever. Fast forward a few years, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is no longer the cherubic child bouncing on empresses' laps, but a teenager grappling with a very real and very relatable challenge, finding his place in the world. Now, you might think that someone who could compose symphonies before puberty would have a golden ticket to success, right? Well, not so fast. The reality was a bit more complicated, and it all started with Mozart's Italian job. No, not a heist, but an educational trip to Italy. Italy, the cradle of opera, was basically the Broadway of the 18th century. If you wanted to make it big in music, that's where you had to go. So off went the Mozart duo, Wolfgang and his dad Leopold, on yet another exhausting tour. They hit all the hot spots: Milan, Rome, Naples. And while the Italian audiences were wowed by young Wolfgang's talent, it wasn't all standing ovations and encore performances. Each city was a high-pressure test of Mozart's ability to soak up new styles and deliver compositions that not only showcased his genius, but also adhered to local tastes. Talk about a juggling act. Here's a fun fact. Mozart wrote 3 operas during his Italian escapades. One of them, Mithridate, Re di Ponto, premiered in Milan when he was just 14. Imagine getting your homework graded by a room full of critics instead of a single teacher. No pressure, right? But Wolfgang was a natural, and the opera was a hit, solidifying his reputation as a wunderkind capable of mastering Italy's complex operatic forms. And yet, despite these triumphs, Mozart found himself in a professional limbo. You see, back in those days, having a royal patron was like having a record label today. Without one, even the most talented musician was just another guy with a harpsichord. Leopold was eager to secure such a position for his son, but the Mozarts faced a harsh truth. While Wolfgang's compositions were adored by the Italian elite, securing a cushy, salaried position was another matter entirely. It was like being the hottest indie band without a major label deal. Meanwhile, back in their hometown of Salzburg, the Archbishop's court was the main gig in town, and it was where Wolfgang found himself reluctantly employed. Now, let's not sugarcoat things. Wolfgang's teenage years were a tug-of-war between wanting to spread his wings and being tethered to the court obligations. The court of Salzburg might sound glamorous, but for Mozart, it was more like musical purgatory. He was a creative genius stuck in a bureaucratic job, his compositions often overshadowed by the mundane tasks assigned to him. Imagine Picasso being asked to paint fences instead of masterpieces. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, Wolfgang's infamous dismissal from the court of Salzburg. This was no ordinary firing. It was a spectacle worthy of a soap opera. After years of frustration, Mozart finally had enough of the Archbishop's constraints and decided to leave. And how did that go down? Well, legend has it that he was literally kicked out the door. Yes, a proverbial boot to the rear. Now, before you start picturing a Monty Python sketch, let's clarify. While the story of a physical boot might be exaggerated, it does capture the drama of his exit. It was a messy, undignified affair that underscored the chasm between Mozart's ambitions and the court's limitations. So, why does this matter? Because it highlights the eternal struggle of the artist, the tension between creativity and the need to pay the bills. Mozart's independence was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, leaving Salzburg liberated him from the shackles of court life, allowing him to pursue freelance opportunities in Vienna, the city destined to become his new playground. On the other hand, it meant financial instability, no steady income, no guaranteed gigs. It was a risky move, akin to an actor leaving a steady TV show for the unpredictable world of film. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we delve into Mozart's Viennese adventures, let's appreciate the teenager who dared to defy expectations. Even as a young man, Wolfgang was redefining what it meant to be a musician, challenging societal norms and the status quo. He was a maverick in an era that demanded conformity. And while that might not have always paid the bills, it certainly laid the groundwork for his legendary status. Stay tuned, because Mozart's journey is far from over, and the best, or at least the most dramatic, is yet to come. And so, with a swift kick, whether literal or metaphorical, Mozart found himself in Vienna, the city that was to become his stage, his muse, and occasionally his financial nemesis. Vienna in the late 18th century was the epicenter of the musical universe. Think of it as the Nashville of classical music, but with more powdered wigs and fewer cowboy boots. It was a bustling hub of creativity, filled with composers, musicians, and aristocrats all clamoring for their piece of the cultural pie. If you could make it here, you could make it anywhere, or so they said. For Mozart, Vienna was both a dream and a nightmare. On the one hand, it offered him the freedom to compose without the stifling constraints of court life. On the other, it meant he had to hustle like a modern-day freelancer juggling gigs on Fiverr and Upwork. Sure, he was composing and performing at some of the finest venues. His concerts were the talk of the town. But Vienna wasn't handing out free lunch tickets. Concerts were lucrative, with tickets sometimes selling for as much as 5 florins, which might not sound like much. But this was the 1780s, where that could buy you a whole lot of schnitzel. Despite this, Mozart often found himself struggling to keep his finances in check. He had a knack for living like a rock star on a chamber musician's budget. Think champagne tastes on a beer budget, if that beer was also imported, naturally. In 1782, Mozart married Constanze Weber, a decision that raised more than a few powdered eyebrows among the Viennese elite. Constanze came from a family of musicians, which might sound like a match made in heaven, but the Webers were not exactly rolling in florins either. The marriage was a love match, much to the chagrin of Leopold, who had other ideas for Wolfgang's matrimonial prospects. But love won the day, and the couple tied the knot, setting in motion a partnership that would be both a source of strength and a financial strain. Constanze, for all her charms, was not particularly adept at managing money either, and together they often found themselves in debt, despite Wolfgang's successful concerts and commissioned works. Now, let's dive into one of the juiciest bits of Mozart's Viennese saga, his supposed rivalry with Antonio Salieri. Thanks to Peter Schaffer's play, Amadeus, and its film adaptation, the world loves the idea of Salieri as the jealous antagonist, scheming away in the shadows. But let's pump the brakes on that narrative for a moment. While it's true that they were professional rivals, competing for the same patrons, positions, and prestige, their relationship was more complex than a simple tale of envy and poison. In reality, Salieri was a respected composer in his own right, and there's little evidence to suggest he harbored a murderous vendetta against Mozart. In fact, they were known to have collaborated on several occasions, which makes for a less thrilling story than the cinematic version. But hey, sometimes history doesn't follow a screenplay. That said, the myth of Salieri as the shadowy villain persists because it taps into a universal narrative, the fear of being overshadowed by someone else's brilliance. It's a story as old as time, but in this case, the drama is more fiction than fact. If anything, the real poison in Mozart's life was financial instability, exacerbated by his penchant for the finer things. Despite earning a substantial income from his compositions and performances, one year he pulled in over 3,000 florins, more than many professionals made in a decade. He was often broke. Why? Because Mozart lived in a constant tug-of-war between his desire for luxury and his meager cash flow. He rented expensive apartments, bought fine clothes, and threw lavish parties, all while scraping together enough to cover his debts. It was a lifestyle that would make even a modern influencer blush. But let's not paint Mozart as just a spendthrift with a harpsichord. He was also a visionary, and his time in Vienna was marked by some of his most innovative works. He composed The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and The Magic Flute, operas that would cement his legacy and change the course of musical history. These compositions were groundbreaking, not only for their musical complexity, but also for their themes, which often challenged the social norms of the day. Mozart was a master of weaving humor and humanity into his works, reflecting the world around him with sharp wit and emotional depth. As for the infamous poison plot, history is a bit more grounded than the melodrama suggests. Mozart's untimely death at 35 sparked rumors of foul play, with fingers pointed at Salieri among others. But modern historians and medical experts lean towards more mundane explanations: rheumatic fever, strep throat, or even kidney failure. It's a reminder that while conspiracy theories add spice to history, the truth is sometimes as simple as human frailty. So, what do we make of Mozart's Vienna years? They were a whirlwind of artistic triumphs and personal challenges, a testament to the chaotic brilliance that defined his life. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was a man of contradictions, a musical genius with a flair for drama, a visionary who struggled with the everyday, and a legend whose reality was as complex and compelling as his compositions. As we leave Vienna behind, remember that the story of Mozart is far from over. There's more genius, more drama, and yes, more debt to come. Stay tuned for the next act in the extraordinary life of Mozart, where the music never stops, but neither do the bills. As the curtain rises on this act of Mozart's life, we find him at the pinnacle of his career, a musical maestro whose compositions were the talk of Vienna, a city not exactly known for whispering. If you were to take a stroll down the cobblestone streets of the Austrian capital around 1786, you'd likely hear a humming of The Marriage of Figaro, wafting from open windows, as if the very city itself was auditioning for a spot in the chorus. It was a time when Mozart's operas weren't just performances. They were events, cultural phenomena that sparked discussions long after the final note had faded into the ether. Now, let's not pretend this was merely the result of some divine inspiration. Mozart had a knack for taking the temperature of society and using his music as both a thermometer and a prescription. The Marriage of Figaro, for instance, was more than just an opera. It was a subversive commentary on class dynamics, poking fun at the aristocracy's foibles with the kind of cheeky irreverence that would make even a modern-day satirist nod in approval. Let's not forget, this was the Enlightenment, a time when people were starting to question why the nobility got the big cake while everyone else was stuck with crumbs. Mozart was a master of this musical wit, turning operatic conventions on their head and leaving audiences both amused and a tad scandalized. Of course, creating such masterpieces wasn't a solo act. Enter Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's favorite librettist and partner in crime. Da Ponte was an Italian immigré with a penchant for storytelling and a rap sheet that could rival any rock stars. Together, they were a dynamic duo, crafting narratives that were as rich and layered as a Viennese sacerdote. Their collaboration bore fruit with Don Giovanni, an opera that was both a celebration of human flaws and an exploration of moral ambiguity. In this era, where every social gathering was a potential minefield of etiquette and expectation, Don Giovanni was a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, or perhaps more accurately, the debt collector. For all his genius, Mozart couldn't shake the shadow of financial instability. It's the classic tale. A man of immense talent, but with a budget that would make a shoestring look extravagant. Despite the critical acclaim and packed venues, Mozart found himself entangled in a web of IOUs and overdue bills. Even with his operas raking in the florins, sometimes pulling in over 2,000 florins for a single season, his pockets were as empty as a concert hall after the final encore. Why? Because Mozart lived life with the exuberance of one of his crescendoing symphonies. His tastes were as opulent as his compositions, spanning lavish apartments, custom-tailored suits, and a social calendar that would make an influencer's head spin. Vienna's high society was both his audience and his downfall, a constant tug-of-war between artistic recognition and financial ruin. It's a sobering reminder that even the greatest minds are sometimes no match for the mundane realities of living expenses and rent due dates. And while we're debunking myths, let's address the notion that Mozart was some kind of lone genius, scribbling away in isolation. Sure, his talent was unparalleled, but he was also a product of his environment, a network of musicians, patrons, and yes, competitors who shaped the musical landscape of the time. He was constantly pushing boundaries, not just in his compositions, but also in how he navigated the ever-shifting musical tastes of the Viennese elite. In a world where the audience's applause was as fickle as the weather, staying fresh wasn't just a challenge. It was a necessity. Yet, despite these challenges, Mozart's music resonated with a timelessness that defied the era's transience. His operas were not just a reflection of the society he inhabited. They were a critique, a celebration, and an exploration of the human condition. They were the original soundtracks to life's drama, comedy, and tragedy, capturing the essence of an age where art was both a mirror and a window into the soul. As the applause faded, and the curtain fell on each performance, Mozart was left to grapple with a more personal composition, his own financial symphony of highs and lows. The crescendo of his career was met with the dissonance of mounting debts, a cruel juxtaposition that could have been ripped from the pages of one of his own libretti. But while the financial books were in the red, his creative ledger was filled with gold, a testament to the enduring power of his genius. So, as we prepare to delve deeper into the final chapters of Mozart's life, remember this. His story is not just one of a composer who changed music, but of a man who lived with an intensity that burned brightly until the end. The music never stopped, even as the bills piled up and the spectre of financial ruin loomed large. Stay tuned for the next installment, where Mozart's journey continues to unfold with all the drama, passion, and brilliance that defined his remarkable, if tumultuous, life. As we turn the page to Mozart's final years, let's remember we're not just talking about a musical genius, but a man living life at full tilt, even as the clock was ticking down faster than a presto movement. By the late 1780s, Mozart was producing music as if his quill had a mind of its own. He composed over 600 works in his short life, and his final years were no exception. Even with his health declining, Mozart created pieces that would stand the test of time, like his hauntingly beautiful Requiem. A Requiem he would never complete, yet one that would become legendary nonetheless. Speaking of legends, there's a particularly persistent one about Mozart's burial, that he was tossed into a mass grave like yesterday's leftovers. Now, hold your horses before you start imagining some Dickensian pauper's pit. The truth isn't quite as grim. In Vienna, it was standard practice for most people, regardless of stature, to be buried in common grave. So, while it sounds like a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, it was just a reflection of the egalitarian burial customs of the time. Sure, there was no lavish mausoleum, but the idea of Mozart being forgotten in death is as misleading as a flat note in his symphonies. Let's get back to the music, because that's where Mozart truly shone. His final works were nothing short of miraculous, considering his physical state. Take the Clarinet Concerto in a major, a piece that dances with the kind of lightness you wouldn't expect from someone battling illness. Or the Magic Flute, an opera that wove together whimsical fantasy and profound Enlightenment ideals, all while Mozart's health was playing its own sinister melody. Despite his ailments, symptoms that modern scholars suspect were linked to kidney disease or rheumatic fever, he was a man possessed, driven by the music that flowed through him like an unstoppable force. And then there's the Requiem, a piece wrapped in mystery and intrigue worthy of a Dan Brown novel. Commissioned by a shadowy figure, turns out to be Count Franz von Wolsegg, who planned to pass it off as his own. This work became Mozart's swan song. He died before finishing it, leaving his widow Constance scrambling to get it completed by his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr. It's the ultimate, bittersweet ending, a masterpiece born from Mozart's vision, but completed by another's hand. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the myth of Mozart's death by poisoning, with Salieri often cast as the villain. It's a tale more suited to opera than fact. Historical evidence points to more pedestrian causes, illness, possibly exacerbated by the rigors of his relentless work schedule and financial stress. But the poison narrative persists because it captures our imagination, a classic story of envy and downfall that fits neatly into the tragic artist archetype. Mozart's legacy, however, is anything but tragic. His music continues to inspire and influence, transcending the centuries like a universal language. He was a trailblazer, marrying classical form with emotional depth, and his operas were social commentaries wrapped in exquisite melodies. His knack for tapping into the human experience, love, jealousy, ambition, ensures his works resonate with audiences even today. And let's not forget his influence on future composers. Beethoven, Haydn, and countless others who found in Mozart's compositions a roadmap to greatness. Reflecting on Mozart's life is like reading a score filled with both delicate notes and powerful crescendos. He wasn't just a prodigy or a genius. He was a man who lived intensely with all the contradictions and complexities that entails. His story is a reminder of the relentless pursuit of one's passion, even when faced with the harshest realities. In the end, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wasn't just composing music, he was composing a legacy. A legacy where the enchantment of his melodies meets the hard truths of his life story, where the romance of the myth is tempered by the reality of the man. And while he might have left this world at just 35, his music ensures that Wolfgang's spirit remains as vibrant and vital as ever. As the final notes of his life played out, Mozart's symphony was one of brilliance and humanity, a testament to the enduring power of art to transcend time and speak to the soul.